the project in London, I was really privileged to be able to participate again in a counselling support session for the victims. And I was surprised to find that on that particular day, both of the groups, the morning group and the afternoon group, were made up mainly of young men. And when you looked at their ages, I think they ranged between 20 and 35. Now, of course, while we have a separate project which documents the violations, what we've also provided for is a support project which provides counselling, either at a group or an individual level. We also provide English classes because many of them come to London and can't speak any English. And of course, they also go to art therapy classes. I was quite surprised, of course, that the young men really were very, very candid about their experiences. First, of course, they spoke about the fact that they had, in many instances, come in the last year from Sri Lanka. Their families had paid huge bribes to the security forces to release them. And of course, when one considers the kind of passage they take, it's really fraught with a whole range of difficulties. But each of the young men, talked about how when they first came to the United Kingdom, they were so stressed and traumatized that almost all of them had tried to take their lives at some particular point. And so there's always this question of being on the edge. And so one of the the challenges that I think the counsellors have is to ensure that they keep a constant watch on the young men until they become more stable. They also come from an extremely conservative culture, which never really speaks about how pervasive sexual violence has been in the history of the conflict in Sri Lanka. And in fact, the community always tries to silence any of them from speaking out. But in the group, there was a huge sense of liberation, as many of them were able to admit that they had experienced sexual violence. I think what they find is that they're safe in a safe community, and the bond is not only one of being part of the same ethnic group or speaking the same language, but in the safe space, they can admit to each other that they experience the same sexual violence, and here there was no shame or stigma. But I was struck by them in the telling of their stories, that first they spoke about the torture and they said, I was tortured. And then they would add, and I was also sexually violated. And that kind of distinction kind of really raised questions for me around why, even for them, they separated the torture from the sexual violence. Now, it may well be that the torture took place during the day, but under cover of the night, this is when the same torturers came into their cells and sexually violated them. Now, that may not be the case for all, but it was interesting the way in which they actually spoke about it. Of course, in my own experiences, I have learned about male sexual violence in Sierra Leone, where I sat as a commissioner on the Truth Commission in Sierra Leone. And of course, at the point when we got there in 2004, around the world, what people saw were the amputations, because it was such a barbaric way that the rebels dealt with the citizens of Sierra Leone. And so when I first got there, everybody said, well, that's the violation that took place the most. But later on, as the Commission began to do its documentation, and of course we disaggregated data, I think we were struck by the fact that, in fact, sexual violence was the most prevalent violation And of course, it was pervasive against both men and women. Of course, when one considers the sort of time, 2004, it was such a focus on women, to the exclusion of really looking at the experiences of men and boys. And so even when it came right to you, you kind of saw it, well, oh yes, it happened, but it's not part of the kind of pattern and trend that we are looking at. And so while the Commission's report is seen as one of the landmark reports in dealing with the proper gender analysis, to be frank, the experiences of men and boys was really sort of invisibilized, and you don't really read about it. And so really it was in the context of the work unpacking war crimes in the Sri Lankan context that I discovered how pervasive conflict-related male sexual violence was and continues to be. And there's no doubt in my mind that in many ways this has been invisible, and that binary gender constructs which pitch who is supposed to be a victim and who is supposed to be a perpetrator has really contributed to this invisibility. One of the myths, I think, is that we need to deconstruct is that only women are victims and only men are perpetrators. And I think we need to accept that men and women enjoy multiple identities. They can be both victim and perpetrator. They can also be bystander and collaborator. And it's a myth, really, that women don't commit sexual and gender-based violence. And of course, one of the most significant examples of this was the former Rwandan Minister for Family and Women's Development, who was convicted in 2011 by the ICTR for the crime of rape. During the genocide in Rwanda, the minister was women dressed in army fatigues, and she would say to the Hutu in Terahambwe, when they were preparing to massacre Tutsi women, why don't you rape them before you kill them? And so during her trial, which was really interesting because it also began to take on a gender construct, because many other women said, well, she's a mother, she's a woman, how can she be indicted for this crime of rape? And in fact, it was a very difficult decision when the ICTR finally convicted her. But it wasn't surprising when in 2015, the appeal chamber reduced the life sentence she had been given to 47 years. The second myth, of course, that exists is that males cannot be victims of crimes of sexual violence, particularly in conflict settings. And of course, as we know from the range of experiences in this room, that males have been victims of conflict-related sexual violence for as far back as we have documented. I think one of the reasons for this is that historically there has and continues to be an oversimplification of gender constructs, including notions of masculinity and femininity. There's also been a tendency for most actors in conflict and post-conflict situations to depict women as having no agency and to depict them only as victims and not political actors. The gender sector has also struggled with any kind of discourse about male sexual violence because, to be very frank, the narrative of war that we have built up, the notion that rape is a weapon of war, is closely linked to the notion that rape is a weapon of war. The victims of that are women. And so they found it very problematic to focus on rape, which encompasses multiple forms of sexualized violence other than rape and even penetration. And I think this is an evolving debate. What's interesting is, of course, that there's an enormous amount of data that is emerging of sexual violence and conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys. So for instance, a survey conducted in Eastern DRC in March 2010 showed that the rates of reported sexual violence were 39.7% for and 23.6% for men. A study of men in a 6,000 concentration camp inmates in Sarajevo found that 80% of the men reported that they had been raped in detention. In El Salvador, an astonishing 76% of male political prisoners surveyed reported at least one instance of sexual torture. So I think what we're dealing with is what I call an inconvenient truth, but also the question of denial. And I'm not going to go into, why the denial, but I think it's important to say that there's a huge question that we have to ask. Who are the powerful institutions that in fact control the narrative? And why is there such a fear of beginning to acknowledge that in fact male sexual violence is also taking place in the world? I think another question, of course, also relates to the question of data, the question of definitions and documentation. And of course, for me as a lawyer, one of the most important issues is how is the law constructed and how does it respond to our perspectives of masculinity and femininity, as well as how does it deal with criminal conduct which is associated with gendered roles of women and men in our society. And of course, in this regard, there have been a number of studies, but I think it was the ILGA who reported in 2017 that 72 countries still criminalize same-sex relationships, including 8 countries in which the idea of male sex could result in a death penalty. A recent survey of the national laws of 89 countries found that 90% of men in conflict-affected countries are in situations where the law provides no protection for them if they become victims of sexual violence. And of course, in 62 countries only, they only recognize female victims of rape, not male victims of rape. And of course, in 67 states, men who report sexual violence are criminalized. And in 28 countries, only males are recognized as perpetrators of sexual violence. When working on Sri Lanka, of course, one of the comments we made in our report was that the legal framework did not provide an adequate and effective remedy for sexual violence, and it only recognized women as victims of rape and only men as perpetrators. More than that, the definition of rape was limited to penile vaginal penetration, and it really excluded the notion of anal rape, digital penetration, or penetration with any other part of the body. And of course, the sodomy laws that all of us inherited from our colonial masters was still on the statute book. Under international humanitarian law, of course, we've always had this question of hierarchies, and when you look at the way in which IHL initially dealt with women, it dealt with women as an honor crime. And of course, many feminists argue that as the IHL provisions were drafted by and for men, who are regarded as the traditional participants in hostilities, IHL itself has been responsible for further perpetuating conceptions of what they would say is appropriately constructed masculine behavior, where men are really seen as victims of sexual violence, and where historically rape was framed as an honor crime. So, on the other hand, of course, some critics argue that IHL is based on the premise of formal equality, which ensures that protection should be accorded to everyone without any adverse distinction founded on sex. But of course, even if we accept that this is true, the reality, of course, is that IHL has been constructed around a narrow conception of gender and the roles played by men and women at both the societal level and in conflict. There's no doubt, of course, that a lot of what feminists say is true. They've really struggled to get the whole question of rape and sexual violence against women accepted at a pivotal level under international law. And it's really their tireless advocacy which led to the UN Security Council adopting Resolution 1325, which for the first time in history officially recognized conflict-related sexual violence. And so what we cannot deny is that that feminist movement actually led to the recognition of sexual violence as a crime. But it was only in 2013 that the UN Security Council in Resolution 2106 explicitly mentioned men and boys as victims of sexual violence during armed conflict. And while the resolution mainly focuses on women and girls as disproportionately affected by sexual violence, it was significant as it provided the first official tentative acknowledgement that men and boys are also affected by sexual violence. But of course, where there is a gap is that there is no human rights instrument or no real policy that significantly addresses and explicitly addresses sexual violence against men and boys. And I think that we should not see this as a competition between men and women, but rather to explore the multiplicity of sexual violence experienced by a variety of actors, including, I think, members of the LGBTI community, which is another gap under international law. So then we come, of course, to the international and hybrid courts and tribunals and their understanding of male sexual violence. Now, it's important when we look at the first two ad hoc tribunals, the ICTY and the ICTR. All of them developed definitions of rape that were gender neutral and reference victims or persons, which really allow for both men and women to be both victims and perpetrators of the crime. But all of the definitions require the perpetrator to use his or her body or an object to rape the victim. And this does not take account, I think, of some of the realities which Chris referred to this morning. Often a male victim is forced to rape a fellow victim. And it's another way in which a man's body is also feminized. Furthermore, the way in which the tribunals and courts have dealt with the development of procedural law have largely been informed by gender norms and the experiences of women rape victims, particularly in the criminal justice process at a domestic level. Of course, in the Special Court of Sierra Leone, what I found interesting when I was there was that the initial indictments in both the Taylor case and the AFRC case included charges of sexual violence committed against men. But guess what? When the matter finally went to trial, this was dropped by the prosecutors, despite this being in the original indictment. At the ICTY, the Tadic case is seen as the one that set the tone for the tribunal there. And while sexual violence and rape were key characteristics of the conflict in the Balkans, sexual violence was routinely dealt with as torture and cruel and inhumane acts rather than rape and sexual violence, despite, of course, the possibility of being able to do so under the legal framework. And here I would argue the prosecutor failed to recognize the sexualized nature of the act in which two men were forced to perform oral sexual acts, and instead of charging Tadic with rape, he was indicted for torture and inhumane treatment, forced fellatio, and the insertion of objects in the anus, were also routinely charged as torture, inhumane acts, cruel treatment or persecution, rather than sexual violence and rape. And this was of course true for the Milosevic case, the Simic case, and the Srebrenici camp cases. So you can see how the one case set the pattern for the others. But I think there was one case which was pretty distinctive. And this was the case of the prosecutor versus Sesic, which was decided in 2004, in which the perpetrator, Ranko Sejic, was accused of forcing two brothers to perform fellatio on each other at gunpoint during their detainment at Luka camp in Bosnia. He was also charged with rape as a crime against humanity, to which he pleaded guilty and was convicted. But notwithstanding the judgment in this case and the evidence of similar violations admitted in numerous other cases, this case stands as the only case of the ICTY to explicitly charge and convict forced fellatio between men as rape. Now, of course, the International Criminal Court, which is really, I think, seen as the Rolls Royce of what's happening at the international criminal level, was harshly criticized for not doing enough in terms of prosecuting crimes of sexual violence. And so in 2014, the Office of the Prosecutor published a policy paper on sexual and gender-based crimes, and it set out their strategies in prosecuting sexual violence, and it uses gender-neutral language, not differentiating between men and women. The ICC also constructed a gender policy document. And of course, what was remarkable in the Bemba case, which of course where the judgment was subsequently overturned, the prosecution included charge of rapes committed against both females and males. They went one step further. They didn't only call female victims to testify, but they also called two men in positions of authority who were victims of rape to testify at the trial. And the way in which they framed the charges is interesting, because they said women were raped on the pretext that they were rebel sympathizers, but men were also raped as a deliberate tactic to humiliate civilian men and to demonstrate their powerlessness to protect their families. On March the 21st, 2016, the ICC became the first international court that prosecuted and convicted an individual, Jean-Pierre Bemba, for male rape under the specific charge of rape. And of course, there one of the male survivors testified during the trial. Now what's interesting, of course, is that Bemba was overturned on procedural grounds by the appeal court last year. And in fact, what that then means is that all of this impressive work went basically down the drain. And of course, what it also raised, I think they called into question, I think a lot of questions around the competency of the Office of the Prosecutor in the way in which they frame this. Of course, one should remember that this was also around extraterritoriality, because Bemba was in another country, and so the question of whether he had direct command control was an issue that came up. But then we get the Kenyatta case, and there the OTP included in the charges active forcible circumcision and penile amputation of men perceived to be supporters of the opposition party. The prosecutor, correctly in my view, wanted to charge these acts as other forms of sexual violence under Article 6.18 of the Rome Statute. But guess what? The more conservative pre-trial chamber ruled that these acts should be characterized as other inhumane acts, again fudging the question of sexual violence. And the pre-trial chamber also ruled that the evidence did not establish the sexual nature of the act, observing that not every act of violence which targets parts of the body commonly associated with sexuality should be considered an act of sexual violence. And to be frank, that's nonsense. If you look at the consequences of sexual violence, and if you look at what is happening to men's bodies, the fact that sexually they're not able to perform, the fact that they're not able to, in fact, enjoy a normal family life, I think the consequences of this certainly suggest that the pre-trial chamber was wrong. Then, of course, on the 9th of June 2014, the pre-trial chamber in the Intaganda case unanimously confirmed the charges against him. And these consisted of 13 counts of war crimes, including the rape of civilians, sexual slavery, pillaging, rape, and the enlistment and conscription of child soldiers under the age of 15, and using them to participate actively in hostilities. And they also included 5 counts which included rape, sexual slavery, persecution, and the forcible transfer of the population. But what was interesting in Intaganda is that the charges also included acts of forcing male detainees to rape women and performing sexual acts with each other, as well as the anal rape of 3 male detainees. So finally, the court has actually caught up with what the reality is on the ground, particularly during a conflict period. But I think that the experiences in these cases, in what one would say is the highest court at an international level, really forces us to ask the question why sexual violence against men continues to be framed as torture or cruel and inhumane treatment. And of course, on the converse side, when we're talking about women, it's sexual violence and rape. Many advocates, of course, argue that one of the reasons for this is an assumption that advocacy around male sexual violence is more likely to be successful if it's framed in a way which draws upon existing well-established norms and taboos. And of course, I think what that forces us to do is to go back and say, maybe your normative framework needs to be recast given what we are picking up on the ground. Another argument, of course, is that feminists fear that incorporating male victims into a sphere that has largely been framed as a women's rights issue will jeopardize the work done by them, raising the profile of conflict-related sexual violence against women, including dealing with issues of prevention. A lot of them also say that it will take away resources from the work that women have been doing. And of course, I think there's no real empirical evidence to suggest that in fact resources have been drawn away. And in fact, I think what we need to acknowledge is that the way in which this issue has been framed, it shouldn't be around the identity of the victim, but rather around what is actually happening. And so we need to understand that the drivers behind conflict-related sexual violence are the same, whether we're talking about men or whether we're talking about women. Also, that the notion that perpetrators use prescribed gender roles to punish and humiliate, and for men who are often valued in their society for their strength and leadership, these, I think, are all mythologies that we need to begin to deconstruct. I think a second problem, of course, is the gender assumptions made by those who lead institutions and where those institutions influence policy and direction. And as long as I think the leadership of these organizations and the legal professionals continue to deny both prevalence and the impact of male sexual violence, we're going to struggle to change the discourse. Another problem for me is what I would call incorrect framing of what constitutes gender analysis, gender mainstreaming, common buzzwords, or the integration of a gender perspective. And many practitioners, I think, make the mistake of equating gender with women, which has been one of the reasons why we've had the whole question of male experiences of conflict overlooked. And one of the most, I think, the most brilliant women activist stroke lawyers, Patricia Sellers, once put it, gender depends on the meaning given to males and females in the context of a society. So why do we speak in reductionist terms, where we reduce gender to the notion of women only? And when we refer to gender strategy, why are we reductionists in reducing it to sexual violence committed against women and girls? And she made the point that this is unfortunate, and what it does is it limits the room for growth. Another challenge, of course, and I just did a sort of count around the room, one of the questions is also the kind of capacity that one needs to build to deal with male victims of sexual violence. I'll give you one of my experiences when we started to do this work around Sri Lanka. We went to the Bar Council, the Human Rights section, Doughty Street, in the UK, and we drew a number of the barristers from there. But then this old prosecutor that I was working with and myself, after reading their first statement, we had to sit down with him and we had to say to him, well, actually, you're skirting around the issue. And you're not actually asking people about their experiences. And you're the ones with the problem because you are not calling it out. And you're not using language which allows people to speak. And I think that raises an important question when you're talking about who the statement takers and who are the people documenting. If they speak a language that is different to the language spoken by victims and survivors, have they taken the time to ensure that the terminology is one that is appropriate? And often, in Sierra Leone, I was struck during a hearing when the interpretation of rape was limited to mommy-daddy business. And I had to stop the hearing and I said to them, can you tell me what the correct word for rape and sexual violence is? And then we had to go to Farabelle College in Sierra Leone to ask them to give us a list of the correct terminology. Because you can imagine by using the word mommy, daddy, business, you're actually denying the fact that this is an act of total violence. And so language, I think, is fairly critical. Many, of course, argue that qualifying the act as torture is more likely to be successful, as the legal framework and jurisprudence on torture is better developed than sexual violence. And I think that's a challenge for us, because what it should do is force us as lawyers to do better work around this. Because I don't think the problem is with the legal framework. I think it is about the way in which we are mounting these arguments. Now, of course, the current context doesn't really encourage men to report, given the fact that there's denial, and there's also failure to acknowledge that male sexual violence exists. Secondly, I think the stereotypes and perceptions which exist fail to acknowledge this. And so really, I think the question we need to ask is, what incentive is there for men to speak out? And of course, when you have the further inhibiting factor, the criminalization in law of homosexual acts, which doesn't recognize the rape of a man and doesn't provide any support, why would men themselves want to call it rape rather than sexual violence? Because of this inherent fear. So I think that these are some of the questions we need to understand. Also, the incompatibility between an understanding of masculinity and victimization. The socially constructed notion of masculinity, which focuses on men as being powerful and who therefore reject being victims, as being a victim is commonly associated with being a woman. The second is the notion that victimhood is inconsistent with male gender roles, and that is why men are keen to call it torture. Male victims, of course, themselves are victims of masculinity stereotypes and may not find the right language to describe what happened to them. And of course, in many languages, the words describing these different forms of sexual violence may not exist. Men are also afraid, I think, of being named feminine, and there's a huge stigmatization. And so, of course, I don't know if you found that, but I've certainly found that often when you start an interview, many men will tell you about how they witnessed this happening to a mate. And only much later, when you've built a community of trust and a safe space, then they begin to tell you of what they themselves suffered. So I think these are some of the constructs we need to deal with. Chris referred to the study that the ITJ published, and I think what I found interesting was that some of the survivors were too traumatized to say more than, I was sexually abused many times. And often it was in the medical legal reports that supported their cases that we found that there were physical signs of sexual violence. The fact that they had problems urinating, the passing of stools, anal pain, and they would often discuss that, but not the sexual violence itself. And so you would need to draw on what you saw in the medical legal report and then come back to the question of their experiences. Some of them, of course, the trauma is so great that they would describe that they passed out and that they were unconscious because of the torture. But then when they woke up, they described waking up with their pants on their knees or with anal pain and bleeding. Of course, sometimes the extent of the torture is such that many of them can't remember exactly what happened to them. And often this happens when the torturers and those who violate them make them drink a lot of alcohol. And remember, we're talking about people who are in detention, so they're in a coercive environment already. And one example is a witness who couldn't remember the details of his sexual abuse, but he said his injuries, of course, suggested that he was anally raped and that his testicles were squeezed. A number of victims often use euphemisms to describing the abuse, saying that they were massaged or that someone hugged them. And so I think that what this is doing is, I think, giving us a sense of the enormous amount of work that we need to do to begin to document this and to provide the kind of empirical data that is going to challenge the assumptions and the stereotypes that are out there. So what can be done? Firstly, I think that if one looks at the women and the women's struggle for acknowledgement and recognition, it has been a long, long time before women were able to get recognition. I would argue that we're in a unique position now, because if you look at the recent resolution that the Security Council passed, again, you have a recognition of men and boys as victims of sexual violence. And you also have a particular reference to men and boys who are in detention. That's not a lot to go by, but certainly it's a crack in the wall, and it's something that we need to exploit. I also think that we need to challenge those in positions of power and leadership around the scale and the impact that sexual violence has on men and boys in conflict and post-conflict settings. I'm sure that out there people must be saying, hey man, when we look at the kind of things people are saying, it's really based on an inadequate factual basis. And maybe the time is now to actually begin to build on that. Secondly, I think we need to accept that the protection of men and women against sexual violence in conflict are not mutually exclusive concepts. The fact that conflict-related sexual violence against men exists and in some settings can be described as prevalent does not make the protection of women against conflict-related sexual violence less relevant. And in fact, the discussion on this issue must be rephrased. In particular, we need to start thinking that deviating from gender norms can lead to all forms of victimization. In my view, only by including male experiences will we begin to see the bigger picture. How many of you know of cases where a man and his wife were raped in the same incident? In South Sudan, in Sri Lanka, these abound. And often you see and hear from the victims of how a woman was put on top of a whole lot of men, and first she was raped, and then her husband was placed on top of her, and he was raped, and both of them were gang raped by multiple actors. And when they tell their story, they speak about how both of them have kept silent about what happened to them, and it has taken them many, many, many years to share those common experiences. So I think it's really important that as the actors in this particular world, that the moment we begin to challenge the kind of assumptions that are out there, then I think we will be able to get a proper picture of the enormity and the scale of what is happening out there. The other is, of course, that everyone has the right to access justice. This is a cornerstone of the UN agenda, and it's recognized by countries all over the world. But by refusing to acknowledge men as victims of sexual violence, what we're doing is we're depriving them of the right to an effective remedy, and we are excluding them from accessing reparations benefits that are set aside for sexual violence survivors. And we are failing to recognize the sexual nature of the act. So there is a need for a change in international strategy at a policy level. And in my view, in the same way that you've had strategic policy documents written which are focused on sexual violence against women and girls, maybe the time has come to construct such a document which sets out all of our experiences, our collective multiple experiences of what is happening across the world, whether you're in Syria, whether you're in Sri Lanka, whether you're in South Sudan, whether you're in the Central African Republic, whether you're in Colombia or El Salvador, the experiences have been the same. And maybe this is the moment when we need to begin to deal with that. The second, of course, is what I would call the inadequate legal qualification of the acts. And I think that there's a real need for a more explicit use of language to describe the different forms of sexual violence, because otherwise we actually miss the complexity of what is happening. There also seems to be a problem around what I would call a double qualification, which is qualifying an act as an act of torture and an act of sexual violence. There's nothing in law which prohibits that, but yet legal professionals have in fact refused to deal with it at the same time. And perhaps another option would be for us to talk about sexualized torture in order to reflect on the sexual nature. But it's not all doom and gloom. And in 2016, the Institute for International Criminal Investigations published their guidelines for investigating conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence against men and boys. In my view, this constitutes perhaps the first step of what I would say useful sources of information on guidance, but it also, I think, reflected a need for a more in-depth document which would help other structures who are dealing with this to actually pay proper attention to it. And of course, one of the things that I've suggested to OHCHR is that in the work that they do, commissions of inquiry particularly need to pay more attention to the development of procedures and systems that will address male sexual violence. I think this workshop, which is bringing together both practitioners, survivors, counsellors, lawyers, is really, really critical, because what it's going to help us to do is, in fact, to take the conversation further. So thank you very, very much. I think this has been quite a unique gathering.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Can we have another round of applause? I know it's a long I think that was really a very thorough and very comprehensive review. The whole issue and the connection between sexual violence and torture, the ways in which it gets hidden, the institutions that we need to start challenging, the immediate needs, the legal frameworks, the wrong descriptions, the politics of why we silence some forms and not others. I think you really did justice to the topic. I would like to thank you again for that, Yasmin, for coming all the way to share with us. Thank you so much. We now have approximately 40 minutes if we're to get back on track time-wise. We're going to take some comments from M.A. Moninga as a discussion. And then I will open up the floor, but I should warn you that I'm going to open up the floor to one particular person to start that ball rolling, which is Dr. Martin Ogwan from La Cho, who I think will comment on the presentation and also bring in some of the experiences of La Cho Hospital, including working with some of the people that we've been able to refer for medical support. So before we get to Dr. Martin, let me invite Aimé, as chair of Men of Hope, to come and give us his observations on Yasmin's keynote. Thank you, Aimé. Said, as an activist for the rights of male survivors,
je suis inspiré par l'exposition de mon prédécesseur, la sœur qui vient d'être ici, que j'ai oublié le nom.
I'm inspired by the words of the previous speaker, whose name has escaped me, Yasmin.
Yeah, excuse me. Il y a un point qui a attiré mon attention.
One thing that she said which really drew my attention.
Et je pense que c'est ça qui est vraiment la lutte des hommes qui sont passés par des violences sexuelles.
Was her focus on the real struggle of men who have undergone sexual violence.
C'est quand elle a dit que les femmes ont lutté pour être reconnues.
And when she said that women really had to fight to be recognized.
Et les hommes aussi doivent se battre pour être reconnus.
And men also need to now fight to be recognized.
Je pense que les femmes, c'est vrai, elles ont lutté, mais elles n'ont pas lutté seules en tant que victimes.
I think it's true that women struggled and fought, but they also did not struggle alone as victims.
Les femmes ont eu des appuis venant de différents coins du monde.
Women did have support from different corners of the world.
C'est dans le même cadre que j'ai dit que votre présence, c'est un soulagement pour nous.
And it's in that sense that I mean that your presence is also it's a support to us.
Et je veux que tout ce que nous allons apprendre pendant ces 3 jours ici, durant cet institut,
I would wish that everything that we learn in the coming 3 days in this institute here,
que chacun de nous essaie d'apporter son savoir-faire dans tout ce qu'on va apprendre.
that each of us brings their experience into what we're going to learn.
Dans le cadre d'aider les hommes pour être aussi reconnus.
As a way of helping men to also be recognized.
Surtout, je voulais tirer l'attention des journalistes qui sont présents.
Above all, I wanted to draw attention of the journalists who are here present,
les membres de UNHCR
also the representatives of UNHCR
et les différentes organisations internationales.
and the other international organizations.
J'aimerais que notre présence ne soit pas seulement du fait de venir faire un tourisme.
I would not want your presence to just be simple tourism.
Nous voulons, après votre présence ou notre présence ici, nous voulons sentir l'impact.
We would like, as a result of your presence here, to feel the impact.
Parce que quand Dr. Chris était en train de faire sa présentation, il a parlé sur l'impact des violences sexuelles.
When Dr. Chris was making his presentation, he talked about the impacts of sexual violence.
Et je pense que pour être reconnu, il faut tenir compte des impacts des violences sexuelles contre les hommes.
And I think if you want recognition, you have to talk about the impacts of what has happened.
Je veux prendre un exemple de
I want to take the example
cet institut qui a commencé ici même
of this institute, which actually started in this very place
en 2013.
in 2013.
À l'époque,
At that time,
j'étais un simple membre de Men of Hope
I was a simple member of Men of Hope.
et j'étais vraiment une victime
I
fraîche.
was really what I can describe as a victim. I was a fresh
Je
victim.
ne pouvais pas parler,
I could not speak.
on ne peut pas prendre ma photo.
Nobody could take my photo.
Alors, durant l'institut, donc pendant le déroulement,
In the course of that institute,
j'ai vu Mr. Ken
I saw Mr. Ken
parler
as he talked,
de ce qui lui est arrivé.
the things that had happened to him.
J'ai vu Alain Kabenga, le premier activiste de Men of Hope,
I saw Alan Kabenga, the first activist in Men of Hope,
a parlé.
as he talked.
Cela a eu des impacts positifs dans ma façon de voir ou de concevoir les viols faits contre les hommes.
And that really had a very positive impact on how I was able to understand, conceive violence done to men.
J'ai compris beaucoup de choses.
I understood very many things.
Alors je me suis révolté en moi-même.
So I kind of revolted against myself.
Les résultats qu'aujourd'hui je suis devant vous en train de parler.
And it's a result of that I'm in front of you today talking.
Je ne parle pas seulement ici.
Pardon?
Je ne parle pas seulement ici.
I don't just speak here in this space.
Je parle aussi dans les différents endroits au monde,
I speak in different spaces around the world,
spécialement en Ouganda avec la police et l'armée.
particularly here in Uganda. I've spoken with the police, I've spoken with the Ugandan military.
J'ai été à Londres, j'ai été fraîchement à Genève.
I've spoken in London, and very recently I was in Geneva.
On a pris beaucoup de contacts.
I connected with a lot of different people.
Alors, je voulais dire quoi par cela?
So what am I trying to say with all of this?
Moi, en tant qu'aimé, pour devenir ce que je suis aujourd'hui, c'est que j'ai eu certains supports.
So what I'm, to become the Eme that I am today, I had some support.
J'ai vu des gens que je croyais être supérieurs se rabaisser à mon niveau.
I saw people that I thought of as superior bring themselves to my level,
Cela a été un encouragement pour moi.
and that really encouraged me.
Et en 2015,
In 2015,
nous avons reçu Mr.
that one,
I'm very sorry.
we received Yaka. Yaka, stand up.
Mr. Yaki. Ils ont apporté un soutien fort à Men of Hope.
They really brought a very strong support to Men of Hope.
Ils nous ont donné la formation sur la vidéo,
They gave us a training in video,
sur la documentation.
on documentation.
Ça nous a apporté un plus dans la vie.
That really gave us an added impetus.
Et cela nous a permis à produire un film.
And it allowed us to make a film,
Je pense que vous allez voir ça.
which I think you will see.
Donc vous voyez que l'implication de tout le monde est très importante.
So again, it shows you how the involvement of very many different people is very important.
Comme ma sœur a dit, il faut que les hommes se battent.
As my sister has said, men also have to put up a fight.
Mais nous avons besoin de tous les domaines pour cette bataille.
We need all these different issues and stakeholders to pursue this battle.
Il y a aussi un aspect qui est très important qu'on a parlé des langages.
There's also this very important dimension that has been mentioned about language.
Les langages, selon ma compréhension,
Language, as far as I understand it,
je le vois dans deux sens.
I see it in two different ways.
Le premier sens, c'est dans la liste dont nous avons parlé.
The first way is in terms of the struggle that we've been talking about.
C'est-à-dire chaque domaine a un langage propre à elle.
That is to say that each domain has its own language.
Les journalistes ont leur langage,
Journalists have their way of using language.
les avocats ont leur langage,
The lawyers have their language.
les médecins ont leur langage,
The medics have theirs.
les activistes ont leur langage.
The activists have their language.
Alors chacun de nous,
So each of us,
quand nous comprenons exactement ce qui se passe avec les hommes et les enfants,
when we understand exactly what is happening to children,
que chacun de nous prenne son langage comme une arme
each of us should use our language as a
pour
weapon
amener plus haut ce que les gens veulent faire endormir.
to draw attention to the things that people want to silence.
Je pense que les hommes seront reconnus.
Then I think that men will be recognized.
Alors, le deuxième sens,
In the second sense,
c'est un sens qui est particulier pour les chercheurs.
is a particular the way in which language is used by researchers.
Il y a aussi la police qui est concernée.
There's the police that are also involved.
Quand vous faites vos recherches, vous êtes devant un homme qui vous parle de son problème.
When you're doing your investigation, you're confronted with a man who's trying to tell you his problem.
Il faut avoir un langage approprié pour donner à la personne l'espace et je ne sais pas, le temps de s'exprimer, de se comprendre exactement qu'est-ce qui s'est passé en soi.
You need to have the right language to allow that man to express himself and give him the space in which to explain what happened to him.
Alors, si vous avez un langage qui est brutal ou un langage ignorant,
If you have a very rough or ignorant kind of language,
les hommes ne seront pas reconnus.
men will not be recognized.
Ça va créer une barrière.
It will create a barrier.
Ça va permettre à l'homme de se dévoiler.
It will not allow a man to disclose.
Je suis très content
I'm very happy
de voir votre attention.
for your attention.
Je peux lire sur la figure de tout un chacun les soucis de comprendre. Je peux lire. I can read in the face of anyone. I can see. You need to understand very well what I'm saying. So that is an encouragement for me, for all of the survivors. Is that we need. Nous avons besoin.
We need
Yes, that we need.
that encouragement. That people are understanding what I'm saying. Apart from the interpreter.
Ok, c'est ce que je disais.
So what I was saying,
Alors que chacun de nous essaye de faire ce qu'il connaît.
let each one of us do their part.
Parce que je sais que vous allez apprendre beaucoup de choses.
I know that you are going to learn many things.
Pour ceux-là qui n'ont pas encore compris jusque-là,
For those who have not understood up to this point,
et pour ceux-là qui ont quand même une notion,
for those who already have some idea,
vous allez encore ajouter.
you're going to add more.
Comme ça, ensemble, on peut être sur le même niveau.
And so like that, together we can get to the same level.
Et puis, on va combattre ensemble.
And we will be able to fight together.
Parce que, je vous dis, c'est un fléau,
As I tell you, it is a curse,
un virus
like a virus,
qui peut détruire le monde dans les jours à venir.
which can really destroy the world in the days to come.
Parce que si on doit se mettre ici pour parler sur les conséquences,
If one starts to talk about the consequences,
on peut faire un mois.
we can spend the next month here.
Alors je pense que l'important est celui de comprendre qu'est-ce qui se passe chez les hommes
So I think it's really important. The key thing is to understand what is happening to men
et comment arrêter cela.
and how to stop that.
Je vous remercie tous
Thank you very much.
pour votre attention. Merci.
for paying attention. Thank you very much, President, our chairman. So now, we still have at least 20 minutes, possibly half an hour, depending on the energy in the room. as I warned you, before we go completely to the plenary, I had specifically requested Dr. Martin to give us a few words about our work together as St. Mary's Hospital at Cho, Ngulu, and Refugee Law Project, with the funding support from the Dutch government and from the European Union and from the Democratic Governance Facility. You can see we do a lot of work with different projects, different donors. Dr. Martin, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. As mentioned, I'm Dr. Martin Ogwa. I'm a senior consultant surgeon, and I've been a surgeon in Lacho for 24 years. I'll just briefly talk of my experience a little bit, but I will introduce Lacho briefly. Lacho is a hospital, 482 mission hospital. It's in Ngulu, which is about 70 kilometers from southern Sudan border. And it has been in this period of war and conflict for the last 20 years. But Lacho itself is celebrating 60 years now, and may I also congratulate the Refugee Law Project for its 20 years. As a young surgeon, I joined Lacho about 96, and the experience, before that I was a medical officer. The first instant which I remember very vividly, but I never understood whether it was sexual violence or it was torture. Let me tell you this story because it kept in my mind for a very long period of time. There was a gentleman who was accused by one of the protagonists. I do not know. That time we were not asking many questions because also the hospital had to survive, and for us as individuals had to survive. But the aim of the hospital at that time was to preserve life. So we never were asking who in the conflict was causing this. Our aim was to treat everybody, whether you were a soldier, whether you were a rebel, whether you were a civilian, and that is the mode in which we were. It was like the Red Cross. We never asked questions, but we treated whoever came to me. So this gentleman came, and they had tied a rope on his testicles. And they pulled it out, they pulled the two testicles out, and it was in such a bad state that actually the whole room was smelling. So by the time I was called, I was perplexed, I was puzzled. Usually in our situation, it's usually cancer cases that smell like this. So I decided to go see the man, and I found that he had lost both testicles. And he needed surely a very quick operation to help him to survive. Sepsis was quickly setting in, and I was a little bit delirious. So I resuscitated him, took him to theater, and the young female anesthetist who was giving anesthesia ended up in a deep conversation with this gentleman. I never understood. So I asked her, what is this that you are talking with the gentleman? He told me the gentleman had said he has 2 wives. Now that he has lost both his testicles, it might be difficult for him to maintain those 2 wives. And he was pleading if there was a possibility of at least preserving one, he would give that anesthetist, I think, a bull or something like that. But obviously there was nothing to do. Well, I talked to him, counseled him, but it was not a clear counseling. And we did what we could do and took him to the work. My second shock came when I went to visit him on the work. I found he was surrounded by, I think it was the mother, grandmother or something like that. There were about 5 females. And they had removed the dressing and put them. And this perplexed me a little bit. And the old woman, I called one of the eldest women around them and asked them why they did that. The woman told me, said, now you see, the family rests on this organ which you have removed, and this gentleman will never be a gentleman in the society. And I asked myself, why should they do such a thing to the gentleman? Why? And that was the only one I saw, and it was really sad. Probably now, listening to what Yasmin has said, it was a form of sexual violence actually. Probably it wasn't torture, maybe he was a well-built gentleman. I think it was to bring him down, to give him to such a low esteem, that he could never regain his status in society. I never followed that up, but coming to the main topic now, I must say this is a common instance, but there's a problem. When you are working in a war and a conflict situation like ours, I divide the period between let us say the 2-decade war in the north, I divide it into two, before Ebola and after Ebola. Before Ebola, I think it was prominent. It was something which was very prominent, which was happening. But the only problem was that there were more dramatic physical injuries. Some of you who have been in the north, you know. There are people whose hands were cut off. There are people whose scalp, I have never seen people who have been scalped. They are the lost, they were only walking with the scalp only. And there are people who are so much mutilated that the part of sexual violence to men just disappeared. Even women were not doing much. So the primary concern of the doctors there, of the institution there, was just to preserve life, to try to treat the physical violence which was there, and try to move on with the limited resources which were there. After 2000, that hospital was also unfortunate. There was a Ebola that struck in 2000, and it disturbed, amid its war, there was Ebola, and this changed a lot of perspective. And I think the war probably took another turn, but it became clearer that after Ebola, and I think people were now in totally displaced camps, the human rights organization became available in the north, and they started talking to the various community members, and that is where I started to know about the refugee law project. And it's in this instance that I started hearing about sexual violence in men, and I came in contact with them because I still ran the same clinic, and I could now talk to them. But there's also one unfortunate thing. There are not very many doctors there, and the time to talk to a person is really not much. This does not come, and I think Yosmin described some of them very well. Most people come complaining of anal pain, or they have some difficulty in passing stool, but they will never tell you that actually there was another problem. On our side, unfortunately, because these are not very repeated episodes, the physical damage which is done at that particular time is not seen. So usually we do our examination and we end up sending this person home without counseling. The deficit we have in this country is that also the counseling services were brought on board by HIV. So it means the counseling services is oriented toward HIV/AIDS and not other forms of psychosocial trauma which takes place. And it's still there. And I'm still very sure that if we get such members who have been violated, it will be very difficult to have them. But generally in the hospital now we have a channel through which we are slowly gaining experience, and we channel the people there. But surely for the women the rape is more prominent than for the men. The men themselves wouldn't want to mention it very well. In the north, I think maybe in the whole of Uganda, people are very conservative. A man is a very important person, he's a head of a family, and I think what men think they are for is to protect the family. So if somebody brings your esteem so low that now it looks, in the north they say now you have become a woman, that takes you to a very low episode. And if somebody does not help you to come out of this problem, it becomes a big problem. And I think a seminar like this is something which is very useful, and I'm really happy that I'm able to be here. However, I think there's a need. Probably we are only talking among maybe civil organization, the laws, the fraternity, and the other fraternity. I think the medical people are not very aware of this. Even us who have been in the conflict for a long period of time, we are not very aware about what is happening. Of course, now literature started coming in place, but the structures in the hospitals or in the unit that should help these men, and also the channel to where the psychosocial trauma can be treated or helped, is not there very much. And I think this is very eye-opening, and it is something that we need to help. And I'm very happy. I see also members of my community in Guru who are here, and they have been with us for a period of time. The opening is coming up, but it's not fully because of that stigma. It doesn't belong to a man alone. This type of trauma is like, let me call it, it's not like HIV/AIDS. HIV/AIDS is between the person himself and maybe his doctor. It's just one person. But the sexual violence goes beyond the person. It involves that person and the family. And if you have stigmatized the whole family, it is a problem. Many people will not marry from your home because the name keeps carrying for a long period of time. So it is important that such talks that we are having here should really spread to all other areas. I think I will not waste more time. I thank you very much for listening. And Dr. Jasmine, welcome to the country, and thank you for this very, very important. To me, it was really an eye-opening. And I strongly agree with some of your thoughts. The language is not explicit. Even in the north where there's a language that describes it, but nobody will tell you that because of the stigma that comes. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kwan. I'm a beneficiary of Latrobe Hospital where they kept me from dying of malaria in 1998 and again in 2000. So I can speak highly of their services. Thank you for that. And we've actually had hundreds of beneficiaries passing through that hospital, and many of them, I'm sure, passed through your hands as a surgeon. So thank you very much for your comments. And it was interesting that you said, because of mutilations were more visible, a lot of sexual violence stuff disappeared, was invisibilized. I think there were echoes of what you were saying about the same thing happening in Sierra Leone. So we start to see lots of patterns in all these different contributions. Let me open the floor now. It would be great to get comments, reactions, questions to our keynote speaker. I should warn you now that unfortunately she has to leave us this evening. So today is our chance, all our chance to throw those questions. Throw those questions to Yasmin. So I'm starting over here and I'll come to Alan.
Good morning. My name is Associate Professor Dr. Sadat Sinakula, Dean Faculty of Local University, and I'm also the Secretary General of all Uganda law deans in Uganda. Now, I'm a member of GAMAC. GAMAC is an NGO which I know that Yasmin is more profound when I talk about GAMAC. In the meetings where we had, even the last which we had at Chigo Hotel, Serena, such issues were never discussed. As we talk about atrocities, because I remember in our last meeting we made some recommendations to UN Security Council, because some of us argue that the UN at times is limited on some of the atrocities, so that whatever the resolutions that are more powerful should be given, that should be recommended to the Security Council, because scholars of international law have argued that the UN is more of a ceremony, and who cuts the cake of the ceremony is really the Security Council, because they have done a lot when it comes to International Criminal Court, where the case of Bashir and others, much as they are not signatories to the ICC treaty, but the Security Council has managed to refer their cases to for investigation. The same with Pemba, the same with the other countries. So it is of importance that if you get a chance to some of the representatives, this resolution should be given more metaphor through the Security Council. Dr. Chris is an epitome to Uganda because he has tried to support through refugee. They came to Gulu. It was the first time, and my students were very, very happy, and the entire community. And what I found out, it was like a new topic many people have never heard about. Then the question is, how far have we reached in use of media and other coverages? I thought of a program. I spoke to the founder that I'm programming to start even a master's in law, which will be part of various and as international criminal law LLM, so that people investigate more. They get a lot of research because academia is the biggest legacy. Because Chris, in maybe 50 years, will not be around as the backbone. But if you put it into academia language, where projects are set or LLMs or masters, then I'm also planning now to make a curriculum on sexual violence so that it becomes a core course within my LLB, so that the younger generation, maybe 20 years to come, they will be the ambassadors of Chris. It is my appeal that political heads within Uganda, you should Chris at least organize one day even for journalists in Uganda. Let them learn about this episode. It is more dangerous than cancer because cancer could be known by diagnosis or by prognosis by we academicians. So it is of importance and prudent that other stakeholders, at least not just calling two representatives of UPDF, we can get the CDF, is our friend. We can even say we are going to go to CDF. Let us explain, because when I had students, many of them have a very bad stigma against the army, because all of these atrocities, according to the videos they saw, 80% were being committed by the army forces or our soldiers, and myself I'm a soldier. So it is of prudence that the army, police and other agencies will be involved. Then, as he has said, medical personnel. Thank you, Madam Yasmin, for such a wonderful delivery.
I think the importance of institutionalizing the learning and the thinking through academia is a really critical point. Alan.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon now. Just afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Alan Gary, and I am a senior researcher with the Institute for Security Studies. I want to first salute Amy Moninga and every one of the survivors that are with us. I think it's really important that you have been able and you continue to share your stories, you continue to speak up, and the issue of language is so important, and Yasmin spoke about it so powerfully as well. And it's exactly what I want to make a comment about. And it struck me as very odd that you spoke about the Dart Street barrister who was skirting around the issue of sexual violence and naming it for what it is. And we somehow think that even within the legal parameters, within the legal spaces, that we have the words to speak, but actually not, and we should really be calling these people at those levels to account, to be using the appropriate words and to say what it is that we're talking about, especially. I was just last week at the International Criminal Court, and we were discussing the Central African Republic and some of the crimes that the prosecutor hopes to bring before the judges in charging the two men who are currently in custody. And unfortunately, the office of the prosecutor will not look into questions of sexual violence against men and boys, despite the fact that there's a plethora of evidence to suggest that these crimes are happening, have happened in the Central African Republic. And some of the reasons why this is the case is they say, look, it's easier for us, it's low-lying fruit for us to talk about torture and inhuman treatment, and what we're interested in is actually convictions for X number of years. And this goes to the question of language, and this is what Yasmin was talking about, and I think we need to really emphasize it more in this week and ensure that we get this right, that we can't just say we're going for the low-lying fruits, because what it does, beyond the legal perspective of it, but it also denies the lived experiences of the men and the boys of what they've gone through, and I think that's the other aspect that I think we need to also introduce into our discussions, and it's more holistic to look at it more than just the legal perspective of it, but other aspects of it, and ensuring that we call it for what it is. So I look forward to hearing you name it for what it is, and ensuring that it is in the statutes, it is in the different domains, Amen, Moninga, just exhorted us that in our domains, wherever it is, whether you're a medic, whether you're a legal practitioner, a researcher, call it for what it is, make sure that it is known for what it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think that's a critical point. I look forward to hearing more from you about Central African Republic. I'm sure you will give us more information about that.
Okay, murakoze cyane.
Thank you very much.
Okay, umutranslator wanjye niba yasobanuriye neza kuko sinzi Icyongereza.
I will use my interpreter because I don't speak English.
Yaje kutubwira ko uri umudamu igihe yavugaga.
But when he was interpreting for me, he did mention that while she was speaking,
Yatubwiye ko ari lawyer.
and that you are a lawyer.
Okay, ana lawyer icyo bagombye kudufasha natwe twahuye n'ibyo bibazo.
As lawyers, what you should be helping us with, who are victims,
kumenya kutwakira neza.
the way you receive us.
Iyo kutwakiriye nabi,
When you don't receive us well,
kubera ko wenda n'indi bituma tutazihuje,
mainly sometimes we don't share the language.
usanga mwanditse ibyo tutavuze.
Sometimes you record and what we have not said.
Turagira ngo rero muduhe umwanya wo kugira wo kutwitaho.
So we want really to have space so that you take care of us.
Okay, hari ibintu ubu bihanze mu makampu.
There are common things in our settlements.
Wajya kuvuga ikibazo cya muri za ONG runaka.
When you go tell your story in some NGOs,
urashaka kujya Burayi ngo wewe ugiye.
and they take it as you want to be resettled.
Ntabwo hari umwanya wo kubasha kumubwira ikibazo cyawe barumva ko ari Burayi se.
And they don't give you time even to listen. They don't listen to you. They think of resettlement only.
Mubyiteho mwandike ibyo tuba twavuze.
You should take into account and record exactly what we say and what we need.
Uriya mudogiteri uvuye hano,
The doctor who spoke,
twifuzaga ko nabo ahanini urabona refugee project iragira amavuriro bakorana nayo.
I think refugee project partner with some hospitals.
Bariya abadogiteri nabo bajye baza mu mahugurwa kuko nibo batanga n'ubuhamya bwacu rimwe na rimwe batwakiriye neza.
I would wish doctors as well to be invited in such gatherings because usually they can testify better what you are going through.
Ndababwiza ukuri hari umudogiteri refugee project yanyoherejeho witwa Beni.
I would testify there is a doctor whom refugee project referred me to called Ben.
Abandi badogiteri bose nanyuraga banambwira ngo ndwaye hernia.
Other doctors had taken it as I'm suffering from hernia.
Ako namugera kuri dogiteri isogondi hernia.
I would meet a doctor and right away I would send away, it is only hernia.
Ariko dogiteri yampaye amasaha 5 yo kwicara tuganira amenya icyo ndwaye.
But Dr. Ben took time, 5 hours to listen to me and to understand what I was going through.
Nibwo mbaze nubwo bitakize neza ariko ubu ndahagaze kuko muri sinabashaga guhagarara cyangwa kuvuga.
And finally I got operated, now I can stand though I have not completely recovered, but I can stand and talk. I think I will have time to talk about my life story.
ariko nababwira ngo inzego zose bavuze polisi igisirikare ahanini ibyo bintu ntabwo byinjirira.
But still, let me come back to what you have mentioned, police, army. Usually they are involved in such issues.
nagira ngo rero ejo project bishoboka nabonye hari imiryango myinshi bazayifasha kugira ngo igere hose muri rusange.
So I would wish refugee law project to go around, meet those people, all these different people.
ariko sina ijambo ryanjye sinarisoza ntashimiye umuntu umwe wanyakiriye bwa mbere kuri refugee law project.
But still, I don't want to finish before I thank someone who received me first at refugee law project.
kuko ni nawe watinyutse gutuma mvuga
And
ibyabayeho.
he encouraged me even to talk and to disclose what I was going through.
anatumaho n'umudamu wanjye kuko nawe twaratumeranye nabi kubera ibyo bibazo nyine nzavuga wenda iminsi iza.
He even called in my wife because I had relationship problems.
arajya kumubwira ndakoresha agatoki n'uriya mudamu uba ku ruhande.
I'm sorry, maybe I will point at her. There is a lady there. I want her to stand. And there is a one called Justin. I don't know whether he's around.
mu rwego rwo kwakira abantu
I want to talk about the welcome.
bajye bagenda bafataho ubumenyi uburyo bakira abantu bahuye n'ibibazo.
That is the real example of a welcome person who just go and take a lift from them.
ndababwiza uko nagendaga kuri blankari banderuye.
To be honest to you, I came on a stretch.
meze nabi cyane nzayobwira cyane umwanya.
I will talk about it. Let me get an opportunity.
ariko tunahereyeho mbere mutwandike neza kugira ngo mbese natwe twumve ko violence dukorerwaho nk'abagabo.
But please take into account what I have mentioned before, to mention and to let everyone know that we as well.
nubwo ari urugendo rurerure.
It is a long journey.
ariko urwaye indwara ntuyirate ntabwo abantu bayimenya.
But still, what I know, when you don't disclose your disease, it can't be healed.
murakoze cyane tuzasubira umunsi uzongera ku mwanya.
Thank you very much. I will make you take another.
Thank you so much. Just for those who don't know our work, we also do have a very good working relationship with Uganda Police and with the Ugandan Army. Very happy to see Kiki here. Thank you for joining us. And we bring these issues into the conversation. So I think we have not had pushback for bringing these topics into the discussions about sexual violence and the broader discussion about sexual violence, whether from the police or from the army. So it's been a good space, and the conversation keeps developing. Of course, you go step by step. But thanks for bringing that up, and I think let another person speak.
wenda navuze izina ryanjye murambabarira.
I didn't mention my names, please forgive.
ntabwo navuze izina ryanjye murambabarira ariko buriya hari impamvu.
But there is a reason.
sibyo hari impamvu ntabwo nanze kuvuga izina ryanjye.
There is a reason why I don't like to mention my names.
cyangwa se wenda nationalite yanjye.
Not even my nationality.
buriya undi munsi muzabibabwira impamvu.
I will tell you the other day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to take one more comment, and then I will ask Yasmin to give some responses. And then I think we may have time for a couple more before we go for lunch. But we're trying to keep to time because we also have our donor, the big donor for this meeting, coming in the afternoon at 3, and quite time constrained, so we want to be at the right point in the program by the time they arrive. So Duncan, please.
Thank you. Amazing speeches. I won't be long. I just wanted to comment on, I've heard lots of people speak about language today. Language used by different professionals. And I don't want to miss differences, but I also don't want us to miss similarities as well. As a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, but also as a survivor of adult rape and sexual exploitation, I found myself often using different language in different settings. As a chief executive of an organisation working with men and boys, somebody who works with British government and police and Ministry of Defence, I find myself using different languages with different professionals. And it's only when I find a shared language, a mutual language, language that helps people understand shame, guilt, all of the things that as a survivor I carry, that enables me to begin to talk to professionals about it, because everybody understands shame and guilt and other impacts. So whilst it's really important for us to teach each other different language, whilst it's important for us to listen to each other about learning new language, let's never forget that we can find shared language as well, and that's where the real communication will happen. So thank you today.
Thank you, Duncan. I'm going to come back after. Okay, we'll take some responses. The importance of language. In a way, this whole institute is about one piece of language. What is sexual violence? What is torture? And what language are we using to describe? Or maybe the same thing. So, with that, over to you, Yasmin.
Thank you. I mean, I think that the problem with the way in which we all do this work is that it's a project, and you're looking for money to fund a project, and that means that you have some indicators that you have to tick off to your donor, and you don't spend enough time with people. Because you're always in a hurry, you have to see so many people, and so you really need, I think, to construct these projects as long-term programs where you can go back and deal with people's support. So, and the other thing I think is it's true, lawyers tend to focus on what they need from you rather than to listen to what you've got to say. So I agree very much with your point that there's a need for us to take more care and more time, and a need really to create a space in which you feel comfortable to share. I do think that it's also important to involve all of the different role players in the conversation that we're having. I think somebody raised the question of the media and journalists. Doctor, you raised the question of bringing other medical practitioners on board. And one of the things we found, I think, in the sort of London project was at least once a year, bringing all the lawyers and the doctors and the trauma counsellors and the barristers and the survivors together, because it helped them to also understand the linkages between all of the different pieces of work. So I think that's a critical issue. But I'm really struck by the courage, and I think, Malenga, the courage in coming forward and being able to speak with such confidence about your experiences is in many ways a tribute to the long journey that you've walked. And so I think that's really, and also for you, being able to speak about it. And I'm struck by what the doctor said, that, and perhaps we don't acknowledge that enough, that sexual violence doesn't only affect the victim, it affects the whole family, and the repercussions and the consequences everybody shares in. And I think that we as probably the people who end up kind of designing so many of these programs, we really have to think about what it means to see sexual violence as a problem that is jointly owned and shared in the household, so that wives are able to unpack why their husbands are struggling, and for husbands, in a sense, to unpack what their wives have been struggling with. And I mean, we've tended to focus on a very silo effect, and yet this is a challenge that affects everybody, because putting one's life together after this is quite complex. And then, of course, the challenge to masculinity, I think, is the real issue that we haven't even begun to speak about today. So I think from all that you said that it's important, but I also think that there's a real need, and I'm glad that you spoke, Professor, about Gamak, and I will certainly take that message back, because Gamak is dealing with the question of mass atrocity crimes and genocide. And so it's really important that they also begin to take these issues into account in the work that they're doing. Otherwise, what are they talking about? So that avenue is important. But the second is also the academic writing, and making sure that more and more students are actually dealing with gender studies in a different way. How many of you have done gender studies and you find that these issues never get spoken about? So there's a real question of how to people who do this. And whether it should never be about your identity or your sex, it should be about the violation you suffered, and I think we should never miss that point. And we haven't even spoken about consequences and what's required.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. Let's take a quick round. I won't take more than three comments. And then by the time we've had the 3 comments and the response, I think lunch may be ready, I hope. Moses.
Yeah, I'm called Moses Balagisi. I work with Men of Hope, and I'm in the executive committee. I really thank this summit today, because it is giving us knowledge and more experiences. But the problem we are facing, we as survivors, there are so many challenges we are facing, because we know the consequences of sexual violence, especially to a male. Or first of all, it reduces the sexual desire of a man. When you've been abused sexually as a male, you cannot function sexually. And also, it destroys the body, the functional body of a man. So my question is, and it also reduces a man. I'm married. This is my wife Judith. And my question is, especially to the police and to the doctors, because the survivors have been facing a lot of challenges when they go to report to police and to the doctor. I thank God for the doctor who is coming from, I think, from Gulu. He has the experience, he has been meeting these survivors. But other hospitals or police, to differentiate a survivor, a male survivor, who went through sexual violence, it is hard. They take you like a gay. I'm not against gay, it's a right. But is there anyhow, scientifically, the male survivor can be differentiated so that they can have their rights and they feel they are not reduced when they go to police and to the doctors? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. I had a hand at the back, and then I will come.
Thank you. Sorry I came late, but I'm called David Wangwe. I work with also the Prime Minister. First of all, I just have an experience that I want to put forward in this house. That during the time we are opening the refugee settlement of Palabeg, that's in Lamo district. We had a partner who's responsible for health. And at that time, they had received very many cases similar to this. So when this partner in charge of health realized that the refugee law project is coming on board to come and implement almost a similar activity they are doing, so it almost caused a conflict. And we had to again call refugee law project, come back on the drawing board and educate us, the Office of the Prime Minister, the partner in charge of health, on what uniqueness they are going to handle. Such cases different from the normal health cases that that organization was handling. So it got to the minds of this other sector thinking they are going to be kicked out of business. And they thought refugee law project would come and take over health. Now, not until these specific cases were elaborated to us, we came to understand that yes, there are men there who are dying quietly. They cannot come out in the open to tell us, to have confidence, even the government, that you see, for us we are refugees, but we are sexually harassed. They would not come up. And at that time we were wondering what miracle Refugee Law Project did to get some few victims to come and who expose themselves and that to be assisted. And we are referring them to Lancho Hospital. So I think, to my mind, and to me, I think we need to do a lot of coordination with the other actors who are working with the refugee operation. We have counselors, we have medics, we have also the activists, but there's that coordination which is still lacking. And I think refugee law projects should do very much more to ensure that we bring on board some of these actors who are critically on ground. Two is the issue of how do we support the families of these victims, especially the wives and the children. In most cases, through experience, because the men fear to come out and they expose themselves, we have had scenarios where the women themselves come and tell us, say, my husband went through this atrocity and they need to be helped, because they think they're losing out their esteem as men, the society they underlook them. So we need to also see how we can bring out the immediate family members, but also the community that they live with, because we also need the community to support these people. So I think we need an open forum. We still have a lot to do, Chris. I know we are limited with funding, but I don't know how we can pool resources so that we get more of these cases coming out to be assisted. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David Wangwe. And let me take the chance to thank you also for your cooperation and your support for us getting that work moving in Namur. It was not easy, as you said. And I think it kind of exemplifies all the tensions around these questions. And there are so many interests involved. We were seen maybe as a threat by the health providing organization, despite the fact that actually we were not there to provide health. We were there to identify victims of particular kinds of harms that they could not treat under the health system in the settlements. But it was very difficult at the beginning. And I think it was, part of it was also because the conversation had not been had about these different forms of victimization, and so there was not that awareness. So there's always a long process. Let me give one more comment, please, on immigration, and then we'll come back to Yasmin for any final remark you want to make, and then we should go for lunch. I know there are many things, and there was a question from Moses to police. Police are not present here right now, but I think they will be there later on. And we can bring that question back.
Thank you. Joseph Wejuli, Immigration. As immigration, we are the first point of contact with anyone who comes into the country. And true, I've heard about sexual violence against men from Refugee Law Project. That was my first time. But I would request that we have support groups, say counselors or the medical staff, right from the entry points. say from South Sudan, or come from South Sudan or Congo. If we have the Chip Hospital in Gulu, I don't know how far we've gone with having another hospital to deal with victims of sexual violence against the men in other parts of this country. Time and again, I will receive refugees. They will come in and all I have to do is pray. I send them to UNHCR or OPM and determine their status here. But I will need a counselor, for example, to help with these other people. I will interface with them, but we will be, just because of the workload and perhaps the expertise, we can't do much. While I'm the first point of contact, I think I also need the training more. Perhaps when I go back, I need to tell my director that as immigration we need a training, particularly to handle this. Because generally as Africans, like someone said, the men will never come out and say they've been sexually harassed. But I think looking at someone and first interaction with them, you would identify something if you're trained to deal with them. So if Refugee Law Project and other partners can extend a hand in training the others, because it's lost about all over. So if we can have these services extended to different agencies, even if it's a concept paper to my director, and government can always find funding to have us trained, it actually is important. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. And I think one thing that often we hear, but which often gets kind of, again, disappears from the discussion about sexual violence, is that for very many refugees, it is the sexual violence that makes them decide to cross the border. They don't, all sorts of things can happen before, and very often people wait too long until it's happened. And once that has happened, they start moving. You know, so, and if you're the immigration at the border, then you really need to understand that that may well be one of the things that has happened to the person standing in front of you, both women and men. I'm going to break my own instruction, though we're going to finish with that comment. There was a hand that I had not been able to see. Devota, you'll give it later. Okay. So Yasmin, over to you for a final comment. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think that when we're talking about conflict-related sexual violence, and certainly when we're dealing with male sexual violence, one of the most important questions is coordination between government actors, particularly in the receiving country. And what we've certainly found in the work that we do both in Sri Lanka and the work in my own country, that ensuring that we build the capacity of both immigration and home affairs officials, those who do the screening, and I mean in London we've certainly influenced, I think, a lot of the Home Office rulings around when somebody should get asylum or not, based of course on the sexual violence that they experienced. And so I do think that that's another avenue of work. I think that the one thing that and I mean most of our countries also have peacekeepers, and what you don't want them, I mean if we look at how many incidents of sexual violence take place in detention or under coercive sorts of circumstances, then clearly that training is also necessary for both policemen and military personnel who go to serve in other countries. Otherwise, what you can find that behavior that is manifested in one country is going to manifest somewhere else. And so I would say that that kind of training is necessary. And I think it goes to, I think, my brother's point, which is he talked about policemen and doctors. Often it's about ignorance. Ignorance about the fact that men are experiencing sexual violence. Also, they don't know how to deal with the people who come before them. Analysis of what is happening around sexual violence, and we brought together the police, the people in the justice system, and I was quite shocked that a lot of them actually didn't know what the questions are. They didn't know what to ask. And it became very clear that we take for granted that people in state authorities are trained to deal with it. To be frank, it's not happening. And so there's a need to do a lot more work. I think the point that you made about language is, it's so much more than that. It is about creating a space in which you feel heard, and that someone's actually created a safe space where you can speak. There's a shared communion, and I think I've seen some of that manifest in the room today. I, of course, have a selfish interest in being here. Your work in Gulu is critical for the Commission in South Sudan. We need to get a real handle on the scale of what's happening. And while I've been very clear that I obviously don't want to tamper with your individual statements because of confidentiality, I certainly am looking forward to a pattern and trends analysis which will help to shore up the kind of work that we are doing on the accountability side. So also we're going to try and make sure that we send our investigators to many of the refugee camps. We've been very, very lucky that the government of Uganda has made it possible for us to have access to all of the refugee camps, and so that's been very helpful for our work, because to be frank, if you don't speak to victims, survivors yourself, if you don't know what they've gone through, you can never speak about it. And so it's quite critical for us in our work going forward that we are able to engage, particularly with South Sudanese refugees, to kind of really give people a sense of what has been happening during this conflict. And South Sudan at this point occupies the unenviable position of being one of those top 5 countries with more of their people outside in refugee camps and many internally displaced than is actually in the country. All I can say is it's been a privilege to listen to your experiences. The way in which you have shared is humbling for me, and I hope that we can take the struggle forward. I think we do need a policy document on male sexual violence. I do think we need to do a lot more work with the lawyers, because it's not that it's not there, but it's about the interpretation and the framing on the sort of usual narrow gender constructs. And if we're going to see progress, we have to engage with the UN, and I think we have to do a lot more work and push Pramila, because I think she's also operated at a very narrow level. Thank you very, very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Please, can we applaud properly? Thank you very much, and thank you everyone. It's been a long session. I just want to make a couple of very quick comments on what has been said. One is on the medical. Again, during this institute in 2013, we actually had a slightly different structure, and we had one day where we went and did a one-day training with medical students, and that was the first time we did it. I have to say we were shocked, because we found these fourth-year medical students, and they were completely blank. They had no idea that sexual violence could happen at all to men. And I have to also say they were very quick in learning, and they challenged their lecturer the very next morning, because he was saying, no, it can't happen. And I said, yes, it can. We just did a workshop. And since then, we've done quite a number of workshops with medical students. Of course, there are always resource issues, how many you can do, and there are so many students, and there are so many different medical schools, but it's a very important area of work. And just on the question of what does Refugee Law Project give away in terms of our data? Nothing. In terms of individual data, we give away nothing. You can talk to UNHCR, because we're having a long discussion with them about what kind of data can we give to UNHCR? Because we've said right from day one, we will never give you the individual story. Never. You can come crawling here and we will not give it to you. It doesn't matter how much you ask. The discussion is, can we say, if we've worked with 500 people, how many experienced, out of the 500, how many experienced this kind of rape, this kind of genital torture, this kind of exposure, witnessing other people's sexual violation? And of the 100 that experienced rape, how many came from the north, how many came from the south, how many came from the east? That information we think we can give. But the individual data, never. The only thing we can do is if a UNHCR or a commission is really desperate to talk to survivors, we can tell them, well, we can ask some people we know if they're interested in talking to you, and if they're not, sorry. Just like this morning, we had some journalists saying, can we talk to some survivors? And I said, well, I don't know. I can't tell you whether they were willing to talk with you or not. I can ask them if they're interested. And if they are, I will bring them over. If they're not, I won't even bring them near you. So that is how that operates. So I just want to reassure anybody who is a client of RLP, your private story never goes from RLP, it stays with us. And on that note, I'm going to hand back to our day manager to tell us, I think I'm getting all the right body language, telling us that lunch is ready.
Thank you, Dr. Chris. Yes, lunch is ready. It will be served outside. We have 2 serving points. And we're aiming to be done with lunch at 2:15, please. So we have 2 points for coupons. Mogi at the back. Mogi, raise your hand, you'll be handing over coupons, and Gilbert on the other side. So enjoy your lunch, and let's aim to be here at 2:15. Thank you.
I'm sure we'll be able to talk about this. When we were whispering, I said, what if the character has actually jumped from our rooftop? What will it mean for us as an institution? I'm sure JJ will talk about that. West.
On your land and so on. And the 5th element is around advocacy, and this institute is part of our advocacy around some of the issues that are coming out of that hands-on work with survivors of a whole range of issues coming out of South Sudan. So I think you'll agree with me that to be a donor like that, you have to be a bit visionary as a donor. And I can say we've never actually had a better conversation with a donor than we've had with yourselves in terms of an ongoing
better understanding about some of the specificities which are there also with sexual violence against men and boys. It's not just to be put aside as something like just torture. It's something which we have to present. We have to think about it. So I think we can probably learn as well about what we have been doing over the last years in the international community, together with the UN, together with the donors, together with you, together with civil society and academia on the SDBV, but also what are the specific points which have to address if you talk about sexual violence against men and boys. I think it's important what happened last month in the UN Security Council is the new resolution 2467, which is recognition also about the importance of addressing sexual violence against boys and men. It's a step. There are quite often those big written down or signed in New York or in Geneva or in The Hague. But I think it helps. It helps to create a context. It helps to create the framework in which we can work, in which we can fund, in which we can partner with organizations like yours, like Refugee Law Project. Maybe last point is we are happy and we will continue supporting Uganda. We will continue supporting the Refugee Law Project. Also in those items about psychosocial support and medical support. Because we think it's crucial, even if you think about a more broader development perspective. What's interesting in Uganda, I think, is that what they call a bit of a new buzzword, the development humanitarian development nexus. Depends a little bit from which perspective you come from. But I really believe that if we don't address the psychosocial support, if we don't address the real health support which is needed, it's kind of a precondition to go on with your life, to go on with the life, with the work, with the developments in Uganda between refugees and host communities. As a last remark, thanks very much. But I'm also very, very, very glad to see the kind of quite powerful mix of people which are here in the room. I see colleagues from the Ministry from UPF, from the police, other stakeholders in the rule of law sectors, representatives from the government of Uganda, but also civil society organizations, and of course very powerful as well to have the different survivor representatives in the room and academia. And I know the speaker on the media. I think that combination of having, and even a diplomat now for a moment, I think that combination is important to push this agenda further. So I really would like to wish you good luck today in what you've been discussing, in tomorrow and after tomorrow, and I really support and we really want to continue working together with all of you and with Refugee Law Project in enhancing and pushing this agenda forward. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Ambassador. I think my task has been done. I think you get a sense of how lucky we are as Refugee Law Project in our engagements with the Netherlands. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think while you hand back, you should also be a bit close because I see the next session and you're part of it. Okay, another round of applause. With that, let me have someone give us an energizer before we move into the next session. Someone willing to give us an energizer? Please. We have people from all over the world, so we may want an international energizer today. Can we have an international energizer?
Okay, what the national one for
Or an academic energizer? Anyone willing? Can I bring it? Around here? Dewa Kiki, I'm going to dictate. Let us have a military energizer.
If you manage.
if you manage.
can, by the way, tell a story and everybody's energized. Okay, we stand up and sing. What do we do? There we go.
Just repeat after me.
Thank you. That's a real military energy. Those from the academia, I don't know how you handled, but I guess we are all on the same page. With that, let me request Jacob, the session chair, to come forward. Chris will be joining us. Duncan Craig, Dr. Yapa, Dr. Thomas. Please come forward. And then the discussant is Phil Otieno. Okay. Here you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience coming towards the end of the latter part of an exciting day, the first day. Some of us here were here yesterday and getting to know each other a little bit. Just as we're waiting for Chris, I should probably, you haven't been introduced to most of the panelists here. And in fact, one person, Phil, has just arrived off the plane from Kenya. So I shall, in fact, let each of you introduce yourself. That's probably the best way. Say a little bit about who you are and what brings you here. And I think we can start before everybody knows Chris, but hopefully he'll be back to introduce himself. So I'll hand over to you to just introduce yourself briefly about who you are, why you're here.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, it's my pleasure to be here. My name is Philip Eric Otieno. I work with an organization known as Advocates for Social Change Kenya. And our key, our core mandate is really to engage with men and boys in areas of sexual and gender-based violence, reduction or prevention, reduction and actually protection. And this we do all across Kenya and with different partners in different communities, and it's something that we've been doing since the year 2001. I'm actually very glad to be here. I had some hitches with regards to my flight. It was delayed. I was supposed to be arriving here in the morning at about 6. I wasn't able to because the flight was cancelled. So I just arrived here. I'm actually like 10 minutes here, so thank you.
Okay, thank you, Phil. So just kind of the brief introduction, and then I'll come back to the format of this session is going to be, we have 4 experts speaking about helping men to disclose, essentially. And we will ask each of you to talk to that topic from your perspective. And then I will ask Phil to be the discussant and kind of ask questions of the other panelists, and then I will try to chair the session and take questions from the floor towards the end. So yeah, Duncan, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Good afternoon again. My name is Duncan Craig. I'm from Manchester in the United Kingdom. For the past 10 years I've been building an organisation that works with boys and men affected by sexual abuse, rape and sexual exploitation. I'm a psychotherapist, so my work predominantly is working with victims and survivors from a health point of view, but also from a criminal justice point of view. I also always want to stand up as a survivor of child abuse and of adult rape and sexual exploitation as well, because for me it's important to not only recognise what I've learned from books in my studies, in my academic work, particularly focusing on sexual violence, but also my lived experience as a survivor, which is just as important. And to be a survivor in a room with other survivors is an extremely humbling experience. And I would just like to say to all my fellow male survivors in the room, I'm sending you some peace and love from me, so thank you for inviting me to be here.
Thank you, Duncan. So, great. And I'll hand over to Dr. I'm afraid I don't know your full name here, so Dr. Yahya.
Yahya Al-Rahal.
Okay, thank you. So if you could introduce yourself first, and then...
So my name is Yahya Al-Rahal. I'm a doctor from Syria. But I'm living as a refugee in Turkey since about 7 years. We created an organization called Lawyers and Doctors for Human Rights. We are a network of doctors and lawyers in Syria, in Turkey, and even in Jordan. Our mandate was to collect evidence for the purpose of accountability and justice. So we are documenting torture and human rights violation according to Istanbul Protocol, which is using science to document the cases. So we are interviewing the survivors, then we are doing medical and psycho exam. But during the last 6-7 years we learned a lot, so it's not just enough to document the torture cases, but also we learned about sexual violence against both men and women accompanied by the torture. We learned about how to train the first responder, like the nurse we saw. So we started a lot of training for the first responder, nurses, midwives, social workers, psychosocial workers, how to receive the survivors and how to deal with them. Also, we are doing a lot of work regarding the stigmatization after the sexual violence related to conflict. So we are doing a lot of community work to tackle the stigma. I will talk about the Syrian experience regarding the male sexual violence, maybe after my other colleagues introduce themselves.
Thank you. So pass over here to Dr. Thomas Osorio.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have been involved in issues related to victims for basically the last 28 years. I started, my first exposure was actually to the United Nations, and I served with the United Nations for 23 years in various roles, from a rule of law officer to human rights field officer. What we called at the time a human rights investigator, I don't know what that means now, but at the time, criminal investigations at the international level, this is prior to the war crimes tribunals, didn't really exist, but we had human rights fact-finding. We were on the ground, so we were registering facts, which is actually, I'll talk about this later, which is the first time that I encountered male sexual violence, which was 26 years ago. And I will show a bit of our embarrassment that 26 years later, the conversation continues. Another thing that is very important, and I think I'll use this opportunity because I've been trying to jump up all day to catch Chris's attention, because we've been talking a lot about language. And language for me is very, very important. Because the tribunal, the War Crimes Tribunal that I worked for, was removed from the language area where the crimes and where the witnesses lived. Therefore, witnesses and survivors had to communicate in a language other than their own. So I want to recognize here today the interpreters, the critical people that are here to help us, because they are not only interpreters of language. And we talked a lot about language. People have difficulties in expressing themselves. People have difficulties actually even conceptualizing what has occurred to them and their families, or conceptualizing their needs and even their plans for the future. Well, these interpreters are those that interpret culture, language, harm, and pain. And I want to recognize you, because I know the difficult jobs you have, and I would applaud you here today, right now. Please allow me to applaud you, because you are a critical link in what's happening here, and please continue the good work. I am very impressed, because you may not have noticed, but I'm watching you very carefully. I want to learn from how you're working, and your attitudes and your professionalism really shows. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, so in the absence of Chris Nolan, who you know, and who will give an opportunity to introduce himself as well once he arrives. I'm your chairman, Jörg Edström, Swedish immigrant in the UK who works at the Institute of Development Studies on Gender and Sexuality. I've been focusing on men and masculinities and gender for the last, I don't know how many years, 12 years probably. And I've been a co-conspirator with Chris and Phil and some of our colleagues in India since about 2012. That's me, that's why I'm here. So I think we should get into the topic, because I'm not sure. Chris will arrive when he's ready. He's obviously got lots to do, as we all know, running the event as well as RLP, as well as many other things. So this afternoon we're asking ourselves, what do we know? What's the state of knowledge? What have we learned along the way here? And this particular session, we're going to hear lessons about helping men to disclose experiences from Uganda, from the UK, Syria and Turkey, in terms of the migration crisis there, and the Balkans, going back in history as well. So without further ado, well, maybe to focus the discussion, can I ask you to kind of try and focus or pull out what is the most important things that you have learned from the UK or from Turkey? So we can then have that Phil Tosh reply. Phil, I say Phil Tosh. Phil is known by many names. Phil E. Otieno. I usually call you Phil. Sorry. So our discussion and so on. So who would like to start? Why don't we start with the UK and hear from Craig? We've lost electricity. So maybe you're happy to speak up.
Yeah. Can you hear me if I speak this loud?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question, how do we help men disclose? I think for me in the UK, it started 15 years ago when I was training to be a therapist, and a boy I was working with, who was actually a refugee, disclosed what had happened to him in his home country. And there was quite a lot that was being spoke about, which resonated with some pain that I was feeling. And it was during that point when I first disclosed, after 10, 20 years, my own experience of sexual violence. Learning about me in therapy. Am I gonna? No? Okay. Learning about myself in therapy was really important, because it began to enable me to it began to enable me to have a conversation that I think about between here and here, my head and my heart. And I began to have those internal conversations about shame and about guilt and about how, in some way, being able to expel shame enabled me to move the blame away from me, that it wasn't my fault, that I wasn't to blame. The only person to blame in what happened to me was the person that raped and sexually abused me. And understanding that narrative between my head and my heart, I think gave me an authentic way of speaking and an authentic way of communicating. The one thing that going through psychotherapy didn't do, though, is it didn't give me an opportunity to meet other men who were like me. And as a human being, we are essentially, we're pack animals, where we need to belong. We can't really survive on our own. We have to be together in our own tribes. And I needed to find my tribe, and so every weekend for about 2 years I would find myself travelling between my hometown and about 200 miles down the road to meet other men and to find a mutual language that we all shared, where we could understand each other's pain. And I transferred that into my professional work as a psychotherapist, and 10 years ago this year we opened the doors to Survivors Manchester, and we started off as a small group of men who would meet in a coffee shop after the coffee shop closed, where we were able to just talk to each other about what it's like to hold on to something that's full of shame and pain and all of those kind of associated negative feelings. Fast forwarding 10 years later, and Survivors Manchester has supported over 2,500 men. Every single day of the year we receive around 2 or 3 brand new referrals. About 70% of the men that we work with are adult males who are victims of childhood sexual abuse where they've never spoken out. Average length of silence is round about 20 years. We have about 30% of the men that we deal with who are victims and survivors of current cases, so where something's happened in the last year. And of those men, there's a small and growing percentage of men who are refugees, who are seeking some kind of place of safety, some kind of asylum within the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom at the moment is a very difficult place to live in difference. So we've had to try and find language and space that means something to us all. Probably one of the biggest moments of my career and of Survivors Manchester was meeting a young man from Malawi who had been brought into the United Kingdom under the pretense of finding work, and actually what he was being forced into was forced servitude into what in the United Kingdom we now call modern day slavery. And nobody had talked to him about his pain. Nobody had talked to him about what was going on for him. People were just treating him as a modern day slave. And it wasn't until a pastor in a safe house that he was living asked him the question about why he wasn't able to share a room with another man, why he wasn't able to go to the bathroom, a shared bathroom, why did he kind of keep himself so isolated. And this young man very bravely spoke out about what happened to him at the hands of the gang masters and slave masters, where he was ritually and on a number of occasions he was sexually assaulted and raped in front of the other people who were being forced into slavery as a way of controlling. My organisation was brought in to work with him because we've spent years helping people find a language, helping people to make those disclosures, and I was suddenly faced with an experience where I couldn't speak his language and he only had very limited English. He didn't want an interpreter. It was far too shameful for him. We could get access to an interpreter. So we agreed to use a pen, paper, and a dictionary. I had to find a dictionary that was in his language and in my language, and a little bit like two children talking, we found our way through a conversation where he was able to describe a little bit to me what had happened to him, and I was able to share a little bit of myself with him. I'm really proud to say that today he's living within England now. He's in the United Kingdom. He has occasionally will still keep in touch. He will send me a message or an email just to let me know how he's doing. But he talks about how when we couldn't find this language, that silence seemed to be his only option. If we don't know what we're talking about, how can we actually talk? And something as simple as a pen and a paper, and we literally drew stick figures, like cave paintings, and we worked out a way of designing the way of speaking. I think what's really important and what I've learned over the past 10 years is that language isn't always coming out of here. Language comes out of feelings as well, and language can be communicated through a whole range of techniques, particularly creative techniques like the film that we saw. I think sometimes we miss that, and the thing that I've learned over the past 10 years is that we must always think about communication in the broadest sense of the term. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's excellent. I mean, there's so much in that. I'm not going to try and summarize anything, but moving from the groups in the UK and the need for that identity with others like me, and then discovering other new subgroups, even smaller hidden groups of migrants coming in, facing issues of exploitation and probably often coming from areas of conflict. And in my head, the question is swimming around on how similar are the issues of silencing and so on, which we will go into discuss, I'm sure. But it's a nice bridge, in fact, to the context of Turkey, Syria, and migration there. So, perhaps you could tell 5 or 10 minutes about what you learned about how do we help men to disclose.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm from Syria. It's a very tough place to be from nowadays. So I will give you just a background about the Syrian conflict as it's going in the 9th year of conflict. About 13 million have been displaced in this conflict, according to the UN numbers, which is about 60% of the Syrian population. About 8 million. No, I'm okay. Yeah, about 8 million have been internally displaced inside Syria, and about 5 million are living as refugees in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and over the world. According to also UN numbers, about 11.7 million in need now, in this year, 5 million in a huge need of humanitarian aid. The Syrian conflict has some patterns, which is, I think, it's not common in other places in the world, like using the chemical weapons in widespread, severe siege of civilian areas. When we are talking about siege, it means even preventing food and medical aid, and even preventing vaccination in some areas. And last 4 or 5 years, we have a lot of polio cases
after it have been disappeared from many countries. We have some polio cases in Syria. Targeting health facilities in widespread. Only in this month, in May, about 20 hospitals and health facilities have been targeted by the Syrian governmental forces and Russian air forces. Also using torture and sexual violence as a war of weapon. When we are talking about torture, we are not talking about individual cases, but we are talking about thousands and thousands of opponents of the Syrian regime have been arrested and have been tortured. And here we started our work to document the torture going on in the Syrian conflict. We are documenting cases according to some protocol, which means to interview the survivors, to do the physical exam and the psychological exam as we are physicians, and building cases for the accountability. But during our work in documenting the torture, we recognized a lot of issues and actions against men and women targeting sexual organs. So we reviewed our documented cases. We reviewed about 140 cases of male survivors, and we found a lot of finding, and we released our reports about male sexual violence, which is called "The Soul Has Died." This sentence has been used by one of our survivors. He said, "My soul has died." So in reviewing this about 140 cases, and we did about 15 cases, depth studies, and we found the range of ages were between 20 to 56 old. And all of them have been detained between 2011 to 2017. All were in different security branches, under the control of the Syrian government. In different cities in Syria were documented by different documenters. There is no relations between the documenters. So we found a lot of type of sexual violence targeting men. So the most common was the forced nudity. The first nudity, and especially is happening when it's the first the detainees arrived to the security branch. They did what they called the inspection of the arrivals. But most of the time, this inspection were in very bad situation, humiliation in front of each other, and including also searching of the anus by putting fingers or putting sticks. So it was, we recognized it as a kind of sexual violence. About 85% of the cases we reviewed, they had this first nudity. Another type of sexual violence we found, it's rape, not only by the penetration of the penis or in the anus or the other cavities, but also using sticks, sometimes electric sticks, sometimes using water hose and opening the water till the survivor start to bleeding from the anus. Also, there was beating of the genitals, and sometimes this beating was in purpose based on racism issues, like when the perpetrator was Alawites, he was telling the survivor who was Sunni that we will prevent the Sunni people to have babies, to not come and kill the Alawites. Burning of the genital organs, tying of the penis. Sometimes the tying was after preventing the detainees of water for a few days, 2 or 3 days. He became very thirsty, then they give him water. So then they tie the penis and prevent him to be for a few days. And that happened in about 5%. Another type is witnessing of sexual violence, even witnessing of sexual violence against men or against women. Treating of sexual violence, not only treating the detainees himself, but also treating him that they will bring his wife or his sister and doing sexual violence against them. So in general, this is the type that we noticed during our review of the reports. In general, about 90% of detainees have been witnessed one type of sexual violence. Then also we reviewed the impact. We talked a lot in this morning about the impact of sexual violence about survivors. So we found sadness and depression in more than 90% of the survivors. Symptoms of PTSD like flashback, intrusive memories, thoughts also in more than 90%. Anger, self-isolation, fear, impact on the close relationship in more than about 70%, insomnia, nightmares. About 60% they reported infertility after the release. Shame, self-blame, or humiliation in 53%. 2/3 of the groups have been displaced from their hometowns following detention and sexual violence. Actually, it was interesting when I heard this morning from Chris about sexual violence, maybe the cause of displacement. But in Syria, not only the sexual violence, but also the fear of the sexual violence. Sexual violence have been used as a war weapon, so the people, because of the fear, because of the shame, because of the stigma, they want to escape from the areas. And that happened also against in some areas like Homs, for the racism reasons, to displace Sunni, which is the majority, and have been replaced by Alawites to be the majority in that area. After we understand the typology and the impact of the sexual violence against the men and boys, also against women and girls, we start to work to tackle the stigma related to sexual violence, because we recognized a lot of underreporting was because of the stigma that prevent the survivor to access the health services, including psychosocial support and other medical services. So we start targeting the first responders that they are receiving the survivor from the first time, to train them how to receive the survivors and how to refer them to the proper services like the medical and psychosocial services, and of course to the documentation services. Also, we depend a lot of the community to tackle the stigma, because we found a lot of stigma is related to the community thoughts and expectation, So also we targeted some community members wish themselves back to their community to tackle, to speak about the rights of the survivor and to tackle the stigma. So one of the experience, as my colleague mentioned, was painting. They did competition of painting regarding the stigma of sexual violence and give prizes for the winners. They used raising awareness sessions. They meet with the community members and did raising awareness sessions. They used brochures. Still, we are in our very early steps in this work. But as I mentioned from the beginning, we are learning because it's something we knew. Syria was a stable country before the conflict, and we are learning during this 6 to 7 years. We're still learning. And thanks very much for to invite me to be here to learn also from you, all of you, and your experiences. Thank you very much.
I'm wondering whether, first of all, we'd like to have Dr. Chris Dolan come up and join us as well as one of the panelists. And I'm wondering whether we should break for a couple of questions and then continue. So thank you, first of all, for this. I heard some of the really things that resonated with me, kind of recognizing the damage done at the start, and that line, the soul that died. There, and then of course, the line of Christ, understanding the stigma, really bringing out, trying to understand the stigma that's the block in terms of disclosure, and then therefore the need to target first responders, service providers, documenters, and everyone, questions around awareness and so on. So at this point, can we have maybe a couple of questions, including from our discussants? But does anybody want to ask a question? Yes, down here.
Yeah, thank you very much. We are here to learn. And my question is, let me first go to the panelists, because the topic is how can you help the survivor to open up? But I will add another question. How can we involve the family survivor to be helped? Because from the beginning we said that when a male survivor is sexual or violence abuse, we include it touches even the family. It touches the children, it touches our wives. I remember when I disclosed to my wife what happened to me. That was 2013 when I got married. Recently, as I was discussing with her, that is when also she opened up to me. Because she was working with Dr. Mukwege in Congo, in DRC. She has a degree in public health. She used to go to the field, and she was experiencing this issue we are talking here. Men and women have been raped in her front of her ears. And then I asked her, when you have been going to the field, have you been just focusing on the women? She said yes, because part of the story, they know that only the women can be raped. But as we have been going to the field, we use also to find men who have been raped, and we rescue them to the hospital, and we treat them as we can. But my question is, now we are leaving the family of the survivor behind. On Saturday, we had a meeting at a law project, and I thank Dr. Chris for what he's doing. Because he invited the parents of the survivor and the children of the survivor. And we had a session whereby they divided the parents, they took the parents to their place where they can share what they went through, and also they took the children to another session where they were discussing. And the issue we have been discussing, I think Dr. Chris, he had a lot. But some of the points we pointed was that when a male survivor is not able to perform the duty at home, he becomes aggressive. When the children come to you, school fees, clothes, hamburger, chicken, you just chase them away. Don't ask me that, I don't have money. You become aggressive, trying to take them away. So now, how can we involve these children so that also they can disclose? And how can we support them? First of all, in education. There's nothing we can give our children. I have a child of 15 years. She's called Hope. She has been down for 2 years. I was not able to help her to take her to school. And she has been crying, say, Daddy, now the children who were together, they are now in senior 3. For me, I'm still in senior 1. I told her, I don't have money to take to school. But now, how can we involve now our children? Because we cannot leave them behind. And my question is on the support, let me call them our supporters, the sponsors. Is there any way, as you go all over the world, talking about male survivor, can you include their children, their family, their wives? It took me almost, let me say, 3 years to get the second baby. My wife, she's not pregnant for the second baby. But it took me time to get the second baby. Why? Because sexually I was weak. I couldn't perform my duty sexually. But as I finalize, let us not to leave the family of the survivor behind. Thank you very much.
Bringing in loved ones of survivors into the conversation, helping disclosure, which we'll hear a little bit more about as it happens now, but also the intergenerational issue about children and the fact that our children are in our lives, and even if we have been victimized in a certain way, you can be a victim, and then power dynamics, you can end up in a situation where your child is victimized through you, essentially. I mean, this opens the big debate. But any other question before I continue and hand over to Thomas and then Chris?
Just here?
Yeah, one question.
A question, is it Dr. Yaya? Yes. Just maybe to understand, we all know the context of Syria, literally culturally, and how have you been able to create a safe space for the boys and men to come out and talk about what has happened to them, looking at the culture of Syria, because as a country ourselves, I come from a community that was affected by war, and I work with survivors, and it's been a challenge for the male survivors to actually come out and speak because of culture, and this is something we're trying to unpack. How can we try to bridge through the aspect of culture and create a safe space where the men and boys can easily talk about what happened to them?
Thank you for your question, and that takes us to the same discussion that we are discussing since the morning. Most of our survivors, they are coming to document the torture. They are not coming to document sexual violence that happened to them. But during the interview, we got the trust, and they start to speak. As Dr. Yasmin mentioned also this morning, they start to speak about the others. Then they start to speak about themselves. Need a lot of trust to build this, and they start to talk. But from the other hand, also they don't recognize these types as a sexual violence. So they are comfort to talk. Okay, I have a stick in my penis. I have electric in my penis. It's okay, they can talk. For most of our survivors in our culture, sexual violence means rape. So only it's difficult to talk about rape. But for the other types, they think that its type of torture. So they are here to document their cases as torture cases, and they speak.
Thank you, Dr. Yes, by all means.
Just want to talk about the family. So in my organisation, we began to have male survivors say, can my wife come and talk to you? Is my mother allowed to come and speak about how bad she feels about what happened to me? So we're going to talk about psychosocial. I'm going to talk not tomorrow, the day after, about the kind of the work. But part of the model that we have is about not just the survivor, but who's around him as well. So when he leaves my clinic and he goes home, he's going home to a network of support that understand his experience. And it's really common for me and for my team to not just have the survivor in the room, but have his wife or his father or his mother. And it's not uncommon for one of my team to be working with the male survivor, and another to be working with the wife, and another to be working with the daughter or the son, to help them all begin to communicate separately, which then means that when we have spaces we can open up to everybody, everybody's in a space that feels slightly a little bit more comfortable in speaking. And what happens is, I think we share the pain, and it doesn't feel as big then. So I completely agree with you around the family and making sure the family's involved.
Thank you. That's excellent. Just to comment about the families also. In our experience in Syria, most of the survivors, they don't tell their families what happened to them. So even the families, the wife, the mother, they don't know. They know that he have been tortured, he have been arrested for a long time, he had very hard condition in the detainee centers, but it's uncommon that the survivor tell the families what happened to them. One of the survivors that I worked with him, he displaced from Syria, then he was away from his wife for 2 years because he lost his performance. Then he took a lot of treatment till he was able to do the complete sexual relationship. Then he bring his wife after 2 years. For us, in our experience, most of the male survivors, they don't tell the families what happened to them.
Thank you. I'm sure we can continue this, but Phil, would you like to, as coming in from the engaging men field, essentially, which is a bit broader, do you have some?
Yeah, maybe I could talk about a little bit about how the experience that we've had, especially in Kenya, which is more or less the same experience that has been going on, has been shared here. But I think the most important thing that we also need to look at is how sexual violence against men, both in times of conflict and in times of peace, is not actually referred to as sexual violence, so to speak, but it is referred to torture, basically because torture is masculine. So that really gives it the masculine perspective. And again, what that does is that it makes it look like, from a masculinity point of view, that that particular man ought to have protected themselves. And I think that makes it very difficult for men to come out. And like Duncan shared, that shifting that blame from oneself to know that it is the perpetrator who was on the wrong becomes difficult, because that's not what the society sees. That's not what is expected of you. A lot of times they will expect you to be the man. You know what I mean? And again, it's very confusing when it comes to the issues of protection, because when that gentleman, I didn't get the name, sorry, Moses, he brought a very good point in terms of how do you ensure that we also protect their families. And I think it's very key, because restoring the dignity of the survivor as well as that of their families is of the essence. And most of the time that does not happen because we focus on the survivor and we don't remember that they're going back to people who also care about them, including, for instance, the wife who thinks that you should have been a man enough to defend yourself. And I wanted to say the confusion also comes when you realize that when you talk about sexual violence generally, it's normally about men should not also act as protectors. But at the same time, you need to protect yourself, but here you have a family that you also should ensure that their safety and security is of the essence. And I think even as we go forward, the issues about how to come forward, how to enable people to talk about what happened to them must be imperative to us and pivotal in the sense that the language, because International Criminal Court right now is having a campaign, they're calling it Call It What It Is. And calling it what it is about bringing out the real thing as it happened to an individual. So being innovative like you're doing, I think that for me, at this point in time, is a very good lesson, how to use pen and paper to just draw the feelings of these persons, because that's very key. But at the same time, I wanted to ask Duncan, having talked of sexual violence as something that is hidden, that is ignored, how then do you bring it out, especially into the limelight, to talk about it in a space where everybody else can be able to understand? Apart from the survivors already know what happened to them. But then how do other people get into the space of understanding what happens to the men?
I think the easiest answer to give is it takes a few people to stand up. It takes a few people to stand up and be counted. Because I think, so some of my work and some of my organisations working a lot with journalists, making film, being part of documentaries, means that the man sat at home who's silent, who turns on the TV or opens a newspaper and sees or hears or reads about us, it means that he can feel not alone. And I remember that myself. I remember seeing other people, hearing other people and feeling not alone. So I think those of us that can, should. Those of us that can stand up, that feel it's important to stand up, I think we should stand up. And I think we should be able to be the front for those of us that at the moment can't stand up. That doesn't mean that everybody who is a survivor should have to speak. It's personal choice. But how we get to begin to start talking is by being visible. And I think that's really, really important.
Thank you. We can take the rest and I'll be coming back.
Yes, that's all right. That'd be great. Yeah. So we'll have two more speakers and then we'll have the questions and discuss it. So thank you very much for that intervention. I really love the way you pointed to this issue of torture in the language, that you can endure torture like a man, in a sense, whereas sexual violence is another matter. So there's a complicity potentially between non-disclosure for individuals within the social context that doesn't like to see our men sexually violated. But torture isn't so bad. Thank you. So there's so much, all of these discussions are so rich, and we could have many more minutes and hours on those. But let's hand over now to Thomas Osorio in the context of the book, and which goes back in time a little bit in history too. And I've asked others to spend maybe 10 minutes. And how do we break the silence and get disclosure? How do we facilitate disclosure?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to the south to add a bit of north at the request of Chris, and I'd like to just bring the context of conflict. You may see some similarities to the conflicts that you've witnessed, maybe not, but I'd like to just add, next slide, a bit of context. There was a country called Yugoslavia, which existed for many, many years, and specifically after 50 years, not to get involved in the causes, there was a breakup. But the breakup was particularly interesting because over those years the population had mixed, they had a common language, and at some point the divisions went back to nationalism, went back to national roots, and created a turmoil where the object of the war were civilians, be them combatants at the moment or civilians, but they were the targets. Incarceration and detention is actually probably the greatest battle that was fought by combatants and by civilians in that war. Can I have the next slide, please? If you take a look, this is the most important, this is why I wanted the light scheme. If you take a look at the map of Bosnia, the ethnic map in 1992, you see the different colors. Those are the different ethnic groups that live side by side in communities. So when the split up occurred, the different ethnic groups sought to create what we now see in 1997, which are nation states built on ethnic groups. How this occurred is through what has been coined as ethnic cleansing, which is not unique. It's just such a glaring example of what it takes. So what happened to these populations? They were forcibly displaced. And you mentioned fear. You mentioned fear. Fear was the name of the game. And the name of the, next slide please. The name of the game, oh sorry. Okay, it's the wrong slide. But fear was what led people to leave their homes. And this is where sexual violence and other means of torture and detention was actually perpetrated for the purpose of getting populations to root up and to leave. I've also been invited to talk about, and this as I mentioned in my introduction, it was 26 years ago that we completed a mission ordered by the United Nations to investigate sexual violence. At the time, we were given enormous resources. However, the war was going on, so it was not the easiest task. And we trained and deployed 10 teams of investigators throughout Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is a picture of one of the teams. The little round thing there at the end is me, with a team where we had language specialists. We tried to have social workers with us, a physician, a legal officer. It depended on the circumstance. Even before 1993, as a part of the human rights work we did, and this is something that, my first introduction was actually in releasing and witnessing and helping to facilitate the release of POWs. At that time, it was the first time that I was 30 years old. War for me was completely new. I knew that I was there to do humanitarian work. I was there to facilitate prisoner exchanges, life for life, dead for dead. And I saw sexual violence. I knew that the women and the men had been sexually violated. And I thought the world understood that. And I thought that my report, we didn't have emails, so we had to write these lengthy code cables. And I thought the world understood that. That, I just spoke to 2 men who had been raped. In one particular prisoner exchange, I was told that a man had been castrated and we need to welcome that person with an ambulance because he may die. Fortunately, I didn't meet that man because before he made it to our checkpoint, he had already been given medical attention. And our reports continued. We sent the reports out. A few months later, the Commission of Experts for the Investigation of War Crimes or Serious Violations of Humanitarian Law committed on the territory of former Yugoslavia was created, and I was invited to be the field coordinator and to put together where I had been and how did I come about the survivors and where could we find people that we needed to talk to and where can we give them help. So we deployed for roughly 2 months after training for about a month. And as I mentioned earlier, interpreters were key. We did not choose the interpreters for their strong language skills. We choose them to be a part of the teams. And the teams were trained in a room like this and before deployment. So Go back. Could you please go back? Just 1 second. But what we found in the report that was filed 25 years ago, a quarter of a century, we found widespread and systematic sexual violence. And the phrase was coined that widespread and systematic. There are many, many people who wanted to hear numbers. And at the time, we heard a report, and we put it in our report, which was we have heard that there are as many as 20,000 rapes of women. We did not say this is our number. We said we have heard reports. This became, and it's quoted now, 25, it's still quoted. We did not want to deal with numbers. We want to deal with sexual violence is widespread, committed by all sides, and is systematic. It is being perpetrated to generate fear. We proved this. We actually assembled the information to show that this was the intent. We registered at the time 715 places of detention. As I said, detention was the war. Moving populations, forcing populations to move. And what happened in detention is everything you've heard, everything that you've suffered. The sexual nature of the torture. I'm also, when I first read, the torture divide, in many, or in my opinion, the men that we interviewed, they were targeted sexually because this would hurt them and hurt their communities. This was something that would instill fear in all the other men. This would instill fear in the families and help them to move from where they were living. At the time, we collected 241 statements, and of that, 16 were men. This went unnoticed by the media. The men were completely removed from the discussion at the time. I stayed in the field, and it's all these years later that I'm looking at this and I'm saying, how is that possible? We documented sexual torture. We documented rape. We documented castration. For me, 25 years later, it's still unbelievable that we are having this conversation. Can I have the next slide? One of the things that I've noticed. I have to mention, the men and the women in the former Yugoslavia, they are for the most part silent. They do not speak openly about what happened to them. They seek services from their governments. They seek judicial responses, which are far and in between. I think that there's been many cases where civil and criminal trials have been conducted. There are very few, but it does help at least to tell the story. There have been a few successes. Actually, it was mentioned earlier today. But the judicial response is very weak. It's not something that anyone can be proud of, but it does tell the story, and it has moved us forward. But reparations is an interesting thing, because in Croatia, and this is a question I think it was also discussed yesterday, and we've heard quite a bit about it. How do I provide for my family? I'm harmed. I need to move on. So what is it that reparations can do? In Croatia, they decided, and this is only in 2016, that they would address sexual violence by providing reparations. So a one-time payment and then a monthly stipend to help people, because they did identify a group of disenfranchised people that actually just fell through the cracks. For the most part, self-help and peer groups in the countries of the former Yugoslavia are related to veterans organizations, because most of the people had registered themselves, they were in detention, so therefore they were combatants, and that's where they would see their care and their peer support. Well, the problems with veterans groups, in my opinion, is that they relive the war. They are sitting next to their comrades who they fought with or who they were in detention. They receive a Veterans Administration pension of some kind, but they're not allowed to work. So, in 1995, you take a 30-year-old, you give the person a pension, And what does that person do? He goes home and he drinks, sits out with his friends all day long, and continues the war in the bar. Continues the cycle. Whereas very rarely, and we've asked this question, I'll get that back to the other side, we've asked this question, when was the first time you broke your silence? Who was the first to hear? And you'll be surprised that because I worked in the judicial field and met many of these men, most of them have not talked to anyone else. I have actually a group of men that I happened to interview them in 1993, 1994, have maintained contact with them, but other than that, they have not sought any other help. So the reparation law, of course, establishes that sexual violence is a war crime. It provides very specific services, the widest range possible. Compensation, as I said, one-time payment plus monthly stipend. Counseling, legal aid, very, very important, because as a matter of fact, very few people knew that this law was in place, and they did not know that they're entitled to the law, and they're not entitled to different rights. So legal aid is actually was of critical importance, which was identified once the law had been enacted. Another important thing is that the reparations did not involve criminal or civil proceedings, and it was done bona fide by a commission, the people that would be able to recognize harm, and they would not have to provide a host of paperwork or so on to prove what had happened to them, because as we know, in sexual violence there are not often scars. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a context of the former Yugoslavia, and a war that you may have even heard about. I don't know if you've heard about Yugoslavia. So I just wanted to bring a bit of that. There are other conflicts, and to see how that occurred. The next slide, please. This is what we need to focus on: is helping them to disclose, and what have we seen as the main factors. For the men, and I will only talk about the men, I will mention maybe the women a bit later, but for the men, the family has been the clear support unit, the strongest of support units. I've interviewed in the last year eight or nine individuals, and in each and every case, the family is the survivor unit. It is the family. The wife knows, the children know, but not outside that. That's become the survivor unit. In the local language, we speak about the victim. We don't use the word survivor. It doesn't translate well in the local language, so we don't use the word victim. And the survivor has become the survivor unit, which is the family that has been supported. So many of the men are receiving support from their families, from their spouses. This is not to say that it worked in every single situation. There are, of course, marriages that have broken up related to the harm, but in many cases, the family unit is important. I think I have a handful of I call them survivors, victims. I have a handful of survivors that I work with that, I mean, they are now family friends. The whole family, I am a part of the family. I come in, there's one particular lady who's the daughter of one of the first people that I helped in '94, and she's now, what is she? She's going past 30. Anyway, I'm like a family member, but I'm the only person outside of that immediate family that they've disclosed this to. And I've never asked them to go outside. I mean, I see that there's a different dynamic. I've never asked them to say, well, why don't you go outside? But they do seek help, and there is a response much later, but there is a response now from medical personnel. Media is critical, and not only to promote and so on, but to combat stigma, and to report accurately what is going on, to give those facts, not to make these fantastic stories and blow up the numbers and create this frenzy about sexual violence. No, but to do honest reporting, to talk about what the governments are not doing or doing right, to be able to support the service providers. This is something that is slowly, and your work here is actually feeding into that, and it is critical, because service providers, and in places like Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, and so on, they have access and they are looking and they are reading what's happening here. and they're looking for solutions to those different problems. One thing that I would when I interview survivors, what now after all this time, I've asked them, because we're looking at what happened 25 years later. So I said I spoke to you in '93, and now I'm talking to you in 2019. What happened in your life? What was the best thing that happened to you? What was the worst thing that happened to you? And so we're able to look back a quarter of a century later and ask them these questions. And they always go back to the first moment of release from detention. They go to that first moment, the first person or the first interaction that they had with someone after 3 months of a camp or 6 months or even a year. Actually, we have one that is 15 months. And the first responders are critical. I think that one of the most important things, and this I've heard this so many times, is the ability, because remember, these populations were displaced, but they had relatives in different countries and so on, was the access to a telephone. Because they didn't have mobile phones at the time. So being released in 1994 or 1995 in a prisoner exchange after 3 months, can I call someone? Can I call my mother? Can I call my father? So the actions of the first responders were key. And for every good story, we've heard a bad story. I've heard Croatia had a wonderful, they had wonderful triage receptions for ex-camp detainees. They had a physician, they had someone to help in relocation, they plugged in telephone lines, they did all kinds of things to be able to help this immediate integration. They had showers ready, and so on. But the medical professionals were not ready for this. And when sexual violence was mentioned in a number of cases, the doctor said, don't talk about that. You've been through a terrible ordeal, don't mention the sexual violence aspect of what happened to you. It's going to hurt you, you'll get beyond it, you're going to forget it, we'll leave it behind. And that is something that we need to fight to change, that the first responders need to be aware. As I said, peer groups are not that strong. I think they should be stronger, seeing the strength of men of hope, men of courage. The peer groups are certainly something they would benefit from, and more responses from government authorities. And something that has now emerged in the last year is interaction and responses from religious leaders. That has changed. I can see that, and I've had 2 meetings with religious leaders to help in our project. Anyway, I just wanted to then bring everything to what is missing from all of this, and what is the key, is education. And you are the educators, but you also educate yourselves. Awareness at all levels, and we need to influence policy through the strengths of meetings like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Great. So without further ado, we're running out of time here, so I'll just hand over to Chris to focus back on the question.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and I will try and be quite brief because I know the day has been extremely long. But on this question about how do we enable, I do quite a few trainings in different spaces. Often I go every year to Geneva a couple of times and train there people working with UNHCR, ICRC, MSF, and so on. And it's interesting, it's changed. When I first went there in 2014, I would make a presentation about sexual violence against men, and people would be there like, what, really? And 5 years later, people would say, oh, yeah, we know about this, but the problem is we can't seem to find those men. Like, how do we actually access male survivors? We don't know how to find them. So that was one of the reasons why we put this question or this topic into the institute. So mine are really around 2 different broad approaches that we have adopted as Refugee Law Project. One of which is around creating safer spaces, and the other one is around screening for harms. And in terms of safer spaces, I think the first thing we have to recognize is that disclosure comes at a cost. It comes with a price. It can create new problems. And actually, however hard you try, you may not be able to prevent all of those problems that can arise. So if somebody really is thinking about, should I tell or shouldn't I tell? I think most people are making an analysis in their heads. They're saying, is it going to be more benefit or more cost if I tell what happened to me? And the only thing that can really generally make it more worthwhile to tell than to keep silent is if you can guarantee that there's some proper response, particularly medical response. And in Kampala, at some point we had some reasonable funding for about 3 years, and we were able to provide medical response and support. Then that funding ended, and for several years we did not have any real money to send people to appropriate doctors. You saw them in the film actually, Ntinda family doctors with whom we had worked, we had built trust, they knew the issues, they could do the right kind of interventions, they could talk properly. We didn't have the money to send them there. They were not pro bono doctors, they were private doctors charging private rates. And the number of men coming to the refugee law project and telling us what had happened to them nosedived. For a long time. Although we were already working with people and we kept those relationships with the people we were working with, the number of new cases coming to us went down. And I'm happy to say that with new funding, and our donor is in the room, Pro Victimus, that trend has been reversed and we're getting a lot of new people coming in and telling us what really happened. I think what we've generally found is if you're able to do the medical, then people say, what about my head? So you fix my body, now my head. So basically moving from a medical, physical medical to a more psychosocial and counseling set of needs. But linked to that, we have found the support groups absolutely crucial. And because the support group can do something that no counsellor can do, which is to let you know that your peers, the people that you actually need to live with in your own community, see you, hear you, feel you, accept you, respect you. And so support groups are critical, and I'm actually really happy to say that I take some credit with the group in London, because Francis, who's not here, but who runs that project with which Father Reggie works, one day she called me when I was in London and she said, can we talk? And we sat down and she said, we're finding so many cases now, but I don't know what to do with them. And I said, well, why don't you have a group? And I'm happy, in February I finally was able, some 3 or 4 years later, to visit the group in London. And they're doing a lot of things which are similar to what we have in Kampala, in Uganda. And they're doing other things which are a bit different. And it's exciting, but I think they're all agreed that it's been a very critical element in enabling those men from Sri Lanka to begin to come to terms with what happened and to go past it. I think a key element in all of our work here has been, try to go at the person's pace. You cannot force people. And so you have to kind of accept that there's no such thing as one day I'm going to tell you the story and that's the end of the story. You have to accept that the story may come out over many years actually, and you may never get to the full story, and that's okay. Equally, what we have seen, particularly with Men of Hope, I would say, because we're close, we see each other every week at some point, is that the new ideas are coming from the support group. They will come when they come. So I think, for example, the idea, let us have a meeting with those of us who are married. Can we have a meeting with our wives? I came from the support group. As Refugee Law Project, we had never even thought about it. And that was the beginning of a very important conversation, which has been slow, but which has got us to where we are today, where we have some people here who are together with their wives in this space. There's been disclosure. It has been, and by most accounts, it has been a very big part of the healing, to be able to finally share rather than to spend a lot of energy hiding what happened. I think, we, in terms of taking time, we don't discuss this stuff much in Uganda, but we did have a conversation within Men of Hope about same-sex sexuality. But that discussion came after, I think, 5 years. And I think Yaka was in the room when we had that discussion. And, it was not an easy conversation, but at the same time it was a useful conversation just to break down some taboos. And you can't talk about sex and sexuality and sexual violence if there's there's certain sections of that discussion you block off completely. So, I don't think we've gone very far with that discussion, but I can say we have opened it up. And I think the second area where I wanted to talk about was screening. And with screening, what do we mean? We mean basically, we ask people a whole bunch of questions about what happened to them. We ask about physical violence, we ask about psychological violence, we ask about sexual violence, we ask about what kind of harms people have experienced, what kind of treatment they have been able to get access to. And the important thing about screening is that we ask lots of difficult questions. And I say difficult, questions which are just difficult to ask because they are taboo topics. So we make it our work, not the work of a survivor. It's our work to ask a difficult question rather than the work of the survivor to break a taboo when they're not sure whether we can hear what they're going to say or not. So that thing of who uses the difficult language, who talks about private parts, who can say the word anus, or vagina, or penis. These are things which are very, very difficult in very many cultures to name. But if you want to talk about what has been done to you, you can either point or you need some language. But if you are a survivor and you come to some organization and you don't know whether you can use that word or not, it's very difficult. So it's much easier if the person from the organization says, did anything happen to that body part or to the other body part? And they can just say yes or no. You don't even have to put that word into their mouth. So that's important. And I think one thing that we have seen with screening is also that you get what we call a feedback loop. So in the course of last year, we were screening people from South Sudan in different settlements. And normally you go to the settlement and you mobilize people and you say, on this day, please come and we'll do the screening. What we started to find, I think particularly in Adjumani, and you must talk to colleagues from Adjumani, was that people started to come to our offices in Adjumani to say, can you screen me, please? Because those who had been screened and they had received treatment from Lacho, they were calling the other people they knew that needed the same kind of help. And so the numbers increased really rapidly. And I think the last one is separate spaces. We have a lot of discussion about this. Should you have separate screening for men and women? Should you have separate activities for men and women? And the answer is sometimes yes. Because you have to recognize people are coming from particular cultural contexts, and they're not going to unlearn everything they were ever taught about gender just because they need some help. So sometimes you really have to make those separate spaces. That doesn't mean that you're undermining gender equality. It just means you're recognizing that you understand where people come from, and that their primary issue is not to have a discussion about gender equality, but to get access to the support that they do. So that was a very important one. And the last one, it actually belonged on the other bit. But what we have also found very useful, and this is a very big example of it, is bring other people into the conversation. Don't just keep it to yourself as an organization and your clients or your beneficiaries. You know, let people expand their horizons and talk with other people and share their experiences. You know, I think bringing Yerka into the discussion with Men of Hope some 4 years ago was a very, very important development, and also quite therapeutic. Because then you can feel like, oh God, it's not just us, and it's not just here in this particular space, but there are other people out there who understand and who can also speak for us. So that has been a very important part of the journey, I think. Thank you.
Just to, on that very note, that's why we're here at the South-South Institute. We're trying to connect people, bring people in with different perspectives, including some of us who are not initially from this field. Bill just flew in, for example. We are over time. I'm wondering whether or not you have enough stamina and patience to spend another 10 minutes perhaps in discussion, and we shall try and close before past. Yeah, we'll take one set of questions, and maybe I'll ask Phil if you have any reflections before I open up, and very brief, obviously, given that we have little time. But okay, questions first. So let's have one set of questions. How many should we go? 3, 4? 3 or 4? 3. Let's start with 3 anyway. You were first here.
My name is Charity Makilet. I work with Refugee Law Project. I would love to hear from the experts to share with us some of the challenges that you've encountered in trying to, discuss or even push this agenda of equality, and particularly focusing on men. Thanks.
I have a question to Craig, to Duncan, on language. Yeah? When you're helping men disclose what they've gone through, have you come across scenarios where what somebody went through is punctuated by silence? They are not able to articulate, they cannot draw, they cannot verbalize it. What about situations where some of those, it's punctuated by silence? How do you deal with somebody who cannot talk, whose atrocity, what he has gone through is muted by silence? How do you deal with that?
Thank you. I know we have one question here.
Translator will help me.
Okay, ni kwibanda ku kibazo kijyanye kuki tutabivuga.
So we have been talking about the question, why don't we disclose?
Ariko umereye kuri icyo,
from that perspective,
ntabwo ushobora kubwira umuntu mutaraba inshuti.
You can't disclose to someone you have not been yet a friend.
Kugira ngo umuntu mugire muvugana mukabanza kugira inshuti mukaganira kuko biriya bintu n'ibintu biba bikomeye udapfa kubwira umuntu uwo ari we wese.
These issues are very difficult to disclose unless you have built trust, friendship, and you can talk to someone you trust. The second thing, there are times you talk to someone that they don't help at all. Why you were expecting to be helped? So you remain silent. Just an example. You have encouraged us to disclose and to speak out. As far as I'm concerned, I stay in a Kivale settlement. But because of what I went through, even up to now, it has been difficult to disclose to my family. I happened to talk to my wife about it. So when I talked to my wife, after 3 months, she took me to the commander. So it is just a summary. I will explain it later. Now, when I went to see the commandant, he put a question straight to me, like this: why don't you do your marital obligations? How can you fail? So I tried to explain what was going on. But he straight referred me to see a doctor. So when I went to the doctor, and he took it as a resettlement case. I am forging stories. So I just cried. Later on, I went home and slept. So I remember what my wife told me. Say it in the face. Someone would look at you and think you are a man, yet not. The following day, I got lucky and met someone. So I got lucky, met someone who directed me to refugee project in Kampala. He told me, Kampala, they have a service not only for English, but the other services they can give you. So what I want to do, I left my place where I could have disclosed, but I came to Kampala where I felt safe. So I was running away from my family so that they don't spread that news. So I told you that when I came to Kampala, I was well received. And they gave me a straight away appointment. So the following day I came back. So I explained what was going on. And they took me straight away to hospital. I was referred to Tinda. So I went through exams in Tinda. And they found that my life was, at the end, had been damaged. I was taken to one doctor in Namuongo called Ben. But still, while I was in Kampala, even my wife could not call me. Calling me for what? Who am I for her? So I got operated. Though it didn't go well, I went back home. So while back home, she straight away put to me, where have you been? You went to see other women? I was saddened. So you see, traveling from Kampala to Mbarara, while after an operation, how my back was. Even my wife despises me. Why are you coming back again? go back to your prostitute. I spent my night at a neighbor. So I wondered what to do next. There is a friend of mine whom I approached and to seek advice. But I didn't tell about the operation. And he said, go and go for your marital duties. I strived. Sometimes we get beyond. I think I can disclose it. There is someone who gave me alcohol. So I was expecting to go because I had taken alcohol to Gandhi to be able to perform. That is how we build our homes. So after 1 minute, when I wanted to perform, it went down. After 3 days, my wife would think maybe he's recovering a bit. So and he would invite me to try again. Because as you know, ladies are very good creatures. When you go find a wife, there is something you are looking for. So when I could not perform, so now the reason I'm talking about this, and it is all about disclosure and why you don't disclose. So I could not even, I didn't have a phone, so that maybe I forward a photo. So I borrowed a phone from a friend. And I wanted someone to take a photo. And I told him that I wanted to forward it to someone. So that gives me some money maybe to buy a soda. So he agreed. She took a picture. Where is Justin? I don't know where he is. He can be a witness to me. I forwarded the photo to him and telling him, it has refused. I can't perform. Please intervene. I even wrote him a message in Kirundi language. I'm very grateful to him because he called me straight away. And he wanted me to report so that they took the step forward. I borrowed some money from someone, reported there, and I was taken back to hospital. And the doctor found out that everything has been worse, damaged to the worst. So that's why I was saying that it is very difficult to disclose. But you see, the person who bought for me a soda went out and disclosed what had happened to me. So it is really very hard to disclose and to open up. Just a summary. Now, please hold on a bit. So to be able now to disclose. So we need to involve families. As you see me now, I'm this smart. Justin and the other lady I talked to, they called in my wife. I had to borrow again money. Currently I need to pay back because I have not yet. So my wife came. And she was sent to Ntinda as well. So I was escorted by a lady there who wears glasses. So we sat together with the doctor. So they explained everything about my case. And now he wondered why I had not disclosed before. But I complained that he had not got time to listen to me. So what should I have done? So the wife would tell him, I'm hungry. So at the time I would just talk about torture, about how I had been shot. So because we need to disclose, that is why I'm talking too much. Maybe 1 minute.
Okay, ubwo tugeze nta makara nta niki
So when I went back, because we didn't have anything at home, no charcoal, I said, well, I'm going away. I'm going to looking for a job. So we are here as a group. You can talk about it. So I went to work somewhere and she was impregnated as I had left. But still I have accepted the child who was born from that pregnancy. So we watched the film there, but I went out, you saw me. I looked at those soldiers, how they kicked, where they kicked me, the same place. So really we want to be listened to. Those space take time. Just to conclude, this world is just open. Tomorrow you're happy, maybe tomorrow. Today you are happy, but tomorrow. If there is someone who doesn't understand that this happens, maybe when it happens to him or to them tomorrow. I put to sanitary pads like a woman in the monthly period. It's a big problem. And I invite everyone to understand. But whoever maybe doesn't have, don't undermine these issues. Thank you very much.
So we have to wrap up fairly soon now.
And even more so for us to be able to have a space where people can come and share their stories. But there's something that every moment that he kept on saying something that I felt, oh my God, is that when we are asking people to disclose, we also need to start from a point of asking ourselves, why do we need them to disclose? Once they've disclosed, what do we do with that information? Not only with the information, how then do we help them? Because there are certain, when we come and say, let's help people to disclose, are we able to handle the gravity of the issues that they're about to lay bare? Because that's very important for us to reflect upon. And I think even as he kept on going on, and I was feeling, let him do it. And I think we also need to allow people to just continue saying it, because we want them to disclose, so let them disclose. And like Chris pointed out, it might take a long period of time for these issues to come out, and he also said that you may not even get to the point at which they say everything that really happened to them. And I think that's also very important that we allow it to happen that way. But one of the key things that I derive from all this discussion is that there is a benefit not only to the survivor, but also to the greater community, to the greater humanity. In the sense that when one person discloses, then you realize that again, there's a support group, there's a support community. There's that feeling and realization that you are not alone. That it didn't happen to you only, but it happened to somebody else, and it can actually happen to another person, just like he pointed out. That those who think that it doesn't happen, it can actually happen to you. So I think it's important to allow ourselves to also create a space for amplifying the voices of the survivors, and even more so for the male survivors of sexual violence. Why? Because of the way we are gendered, the way we are socialized. Men are not allowed to talk about these things because they are not seen to be man enough if somebody encroached into your body, into your space. And that becomes something that we need to think about. And I think very quickly, so that I give the floor to the other panelist, is that violence of any nature, be it to a man, a woman, a child, should never be justified, rationalized, or condoned. And I think every time somebody comes to you, it's important to listen to them. Just lend them that ear. Just listen to them. And I think Dr. Thomas said something very profound with regards to the issues of creating awareness so that people get to understand. Because sometimes people think this is something that is way too far. But again, in issues of when we reflect upon language, we also need to not to sound like we are competing with the other women's rights organizations, for instance. When I know Chris and your team, you have this video on men can be raped too. You know, the reference of men can be raped too sounds like you also need to think about me. We just need to talk directly. We don't need to be passive about these issues, because I feel that's passivity. We need to be very direct in the way we say it, because when you talk about issues of advocacy, the framing of the language, of the narrative about men and how they are violated is very passive in nature and is never given the weight which it deserves. And Charity, you asked about challenges that we experience. That's one of the challenges. Because again, when you talk about issues of sexual violence against men, then it becomes men versus women, and how much women are violated more than men. And that's a challenge. And when you bring it into a space, men will be told you are shining a spotlight on your vulnerabilities. And therefore, that is shoved to the back burner. And I think it's something that we need to come up on. And lastly, I would like to say that we need to think about the space of research in terms of documentation, because research will form policy to help us advocate more on how these things can be taken care of, and engagement with the media, because if it is a man who has been violated, the media has a way of sensationalizing the issue, because it is about the dog has been beaten by a human being rather than the dog beat a man. So we need to also to find ways of how the media can be engaged in awareness creation, building their capacity to be able to respond and to be able to articulate issues in a way that is very good. So with regards to partnerships, that's very key. We cannot do things in isolation. We cannot tackle this menace in isolation. And we really need everybody to be on board and just to say no to sexual violence, including sexual violence that is meted upon men. And lastly, Dr. even as you'll be speaking, I would like to elucidate more on issues of race and ethnicity and issues of cleansing, because again, I saw that in Kenya, where you will realize that apart from the police and the military, who are the main perpetrators, you realize that other communities, the combatants from other communities, were doing it because they wanted to reduce the voting power of these other communities. So that's something that we also saw during the elections in 2007 and 2017 in Kenya. Maybe you can talk about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Phil. So in the interest of time, we are really over time, so if we can keep it, any final thoughts or replies, very, very brief, and then we'll close the session. Thank you. So, Dr. Yash.
Yes, actually it's more about the changing of the demography of the areas, because the people in Syria, they don't have the right to vote even. We don't have election in Syria. So it's more about changing the demography.
In terms of the challenges that Charity asked, I think one of the biggest challenges is that this doesn't become a fight between genders and between populations, actually, that we're all kind of in it together, recognising difference whilst also recognising similarity. In terms of your question, yes, I mean, I'm happy to speak to you in much more detail about it, but working with people who physically can't, from a psychological point of view, but physically can't share their story, the one way that we will do that, I start in, my record at the moment is 6 So 6 weekly sessions where I've sat with the person in silence because that person hasn't got the ability to say anything. But every week they turn up. Every single week they show themselves. And it's my responsibility to share that space with them. And after that 6th week, where the person unzipped their coat and took their coat off, it was a way of that person saying to me, okay, now I want to be here. And that's how we begin to start having conversations. So, but I'm happy to talk to you in more detail about that.
Thank you, Derek. I just wanted to clarify one point. When I was saying that there is very little peer support, there's in the clients that I'm talking about, there are institutional support, group therapies and so on, but normally run institutionally. There are very, very few associations of survivors that work together, but institutionally there is quite a bit of support, and that's what's being relied on. So I just wanted to clarify that point.
Thanks. Chris.
I started talking at 7:30 this morning. I'm done. Thank you very much, everybody.
And thanks almost to you, the audience, survivors groups, stakeholders. It's been a long day, some fabulous discussions. We've opened up more territory than we can possibly chew on today. And hopefully we have another couple of days to get further into details and learn so much more. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you over dinner tomorrow.
Let's give them another round of applause as they take their seats. One of the most difficult things is holding up his pace towards the end of the day, but we all agree with that they did a marvelous job. So let's give them a loud round of applause, please. With that marks the end of the day. We can interact more over evening tea, served right outside there. And enjoy your evening, interact more. It never ends, learning continues. So enjoy your evening, those who are staying here. We know that you'll continue interacting and learning more from each other. All the best. Thank you.